Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. One afternoon in January of 1998, a prosecutor for the state of Georgia sat in the very back row of seats in a courtroom where a divorce trial was unfolding. Now, this prosecutor was not involved in this divorce case. He handled murder trials. But he had still come here today because he had gotten a very surprising phone call about an unsolved murder case he had worked on a year and a half earlier. The caller had told him that the testimony in this divorce case could potentially solve that murder. Now, in the courtroom, the prosecutor felt his heart rate pick up as the witness he had been waiting for finally took the stand. And as soon as the witness began talking, the prosecutor knew he had just solved that murder. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, on the next very hot day, offer the follow button a nice ice-cold cup of water. Except don't tell them it's actually white vinegar. Okay, let's get into today's story. On August 7, 1996, a 41-year-old entrepreneur named Lance Herndon woke up at 3:40 a.m. to the sound of his alarm clock going off inside of his mansion in Roswell, Georgia. The alarm was actually one of 3 alarms set to go off that morning. The first was at 3:40, the second at 3:50, and the third at 4 a.m. And this was actually how every workday began for Lance. He was the founder of an IT consulting company called Access Inc., and his borderline compulsive work ethic not only made him millions of dollars, but also it had made him a trailblazer for the black business community in Greater Atlanta. His company, Access Inc., had actually been awarded the National Service Firm of the Year award by President George H.W. Bush. President Clinton had honored Lance with the Minority Entrepreneur of the Year award and had appointed him to the 1995 White House Conference on Small Business. Lance sat up and slammed his hand down on the clock to stop the alarm, and then shut off the other 2 alarms so they wouldn't ring. Then he threw aside his bed sheets and got up and walked over to the dresser to pull out some clothes. On top of his dresser, he kept a sexy lingerie photograph of one of his girlfriends, a woman he'd been seeing for years named Kathy Collins. Now, usually when Lance saw this photograph, he would smile, but today he flipped it face down so he wouldn't have to look at it. He was going to have to break up with Kathy, and he was not looking forward to it. Lance and Kathy had been on again, off again since they first met 3 years ago. But they'd rekindled things for real about 7 months ago, and she had moved most of her stuff into his house. But for Lance, this progression sort of made the whole thing feel too serious. He sort of preferred to play the field. In fact, at that very moment, he didn't just have this one girlfriend. He had another steady girlfriend, a 27-year-old college student named Dion Baugh, and he was also interested in another woman that he had just met who worked as a school teacher. Plus, he was also still dealing with the fallout from his divorce from his third wife, Janine Herndon, who he had a 4-year-old son with. Lance actually had to keep meticulous notes in his calendar just to keep all of this straight, and it was really starting to wear on him. Plus, in addition to dumping Kathy, something he knew he needed to do soon, he was also considering dumping Dion as well, because she was the jealous type and he just felt like he didn't need the drama. But for now, Lance threw on a shirt and a pair of pants and then headed downstairs into his basement, where he had a full working office set up for his IT company. Every day, Lance's small staff of full-time employees, plus his assistant, came to this basement office to do all their work. But they wouldn't actually arrive here for another 4 hours, which gave Lance plenty of time to get everything ready. Lance sat down at his desk, hit the record button on a small tape recorder, and started dictating detailed lists of instructions for each of his employees. Every morning, he would make these cassette tapes so that when his employees came in, they knew exactly what he wanted them to do, even if he had already gone out for the day, which he was doing more and more lately. When Lance had first started Access Inc., he had pretty much worked exclusively on his business all the time and was never really out of the office. But recently, business had not been going very well, and so Lance's attention was now split between, a growing list of problems and new ventures he was considering. He hadn't told anybody the details, but Access Inc. was in pretty big financial trouble. At its peak, it had been valued at more than $3 million. But now the business was heavily in debt and losing money. Lance had tried to diversify by investing in a hip-hop club in downtown Atlanta, but that had failed, and now he was embroiled in a lawsuit with his former business partner. Add all that to the alimony and child support that Lance was paying to his ex-wife, plus the lavish lifestyles he was funding for his various girlfriends, and for the first time in his life, Lance was starting to worry about whether he could even hold everything together. Lance finished the cassette tapes for his employees and left them on their desks. Then he went back upstairs to get ready for his day. By the time his workers actually started arriving at 8 a.m. through the designated office side door, Lance was already halfway through his list of daily tasks in his calendar. Which meant, by the time the late afternoon rolled around, Lance was free to leave his house, and therefore his office, and go to his mother's house to have dinner. His grandmother, who was visiting from out of town, was going to be at this dinner, along with Lance's ex-wife and their son. But despite wanting to see his family, Lance didn't stay for very long. At around 8 p.m., he told his mother, his grandmother, his ex-wife, and his son that he had to get back to work. Then he said goodbye and drove the 5 minutes back to his house. When Lance pulled back into his driveway, he saw his secretary's light blue car parked in its usual spot, and he smiled. His secretary was a woman named Talana Caraway, and she was one of his closest friends. They had been romantic in the past. In fact, Lance's divorce was caused in part by the fact that his wife had found racy pictures he had of Talana. But now, their relationship was purely platonic, and they both actually confided in each other about their respective love lives. Talana worked another full-time job, so she typically only worked evenings for Lance. Lance went in the office door and found Talana working her way through the list of tasks that he had outlined for her on her cassette tape. Talana was very obviously happy to see him, and for a little while, the two of them just sat there chatting and catching up. Talana was apparently having trouble with her partner, a guy named Jazz, and she complained about him a bit. Lance actually knew Jazz because he had lent him some money, and he nodded sympathetically. Lance told Talana that he was actually hoping for a fresh start in the romance department, because he had another new woman, but this one he was really interested in. He said she was a teacher and she was really nice, and he asked Talana if she would help him write her a card. And like he knew she would, Talana just laughed. Like, the idea that the ex-girlfriend is now writing a card for the new girlfriend was just kind of comical to her. But this was actually one of the things that Lance really liked best about Talana, and it's why their relationship continued to flourish. She was just easygoing, unlike his various current girlfriends. And so Talana, without any hesitation, helped write the card, and then Lance signed it. As Lance stood up to head upstairs, Talana gestured for him to wait. Then she handed him a couple slips of paper. She said they were messages from his girlfriend Dion, who had called for him a couple of times while he was out. At this, Lance groaned. Dion was a lot to deal with. A month earlier, she'd shown up at his house unannounced while Kathy was over. Dion had seen Kathy through the window, and she had made such a scene that Lance actually had to call the police. She actually had a court hearing about that incident tomorrow that Lance was supposed to go to. Lance thanked Talana for the messages, and then he went upstairs to his bedroom to begin moving Kathy's things out of his closet. About 2.5 hours later, at around 10:30 p.m., Talana came upstairs and told Lance she'd see him tomorrow. It was raining, so Lance made her promise to call him when she got home so he knew she was safe. And she would do that around 11:30 p.m., and they actually chatted for another few minutes on the phone. But at some point, Lance told Talana goodnight. He could have talked to her for hours, but he knew that he didn't have long before his morning alarms would start going off. The next morning, August 8th, at exactly 8 a.m., one of Lance's employees arrived at his house and unlocked the side office door. And the first thing she noticed when she stepped inside was that Lance was not there. This was weird because even on days where Lance left early, he was usually at his desk first thing in the morning. But the employee figured that maybe Lance had an appointment. So she went over to his calendar to check to see where he was, but, sort of atypical for him, there was nothing listed for that day. That was when she noticed the second thing, which was that Lance had not left her a cassette tape for the day. And this was not just weird, it was completely unprecedented. Lance had literally never not left her a tape. And so the employee paged Lance, but he didn't answer. So, unsure what else to do, the employee just sat down and started to work. About an hour later, at 9 a.m., another employee arrived, but there was still no sign of Lance. The two employees paged him a few more times, but he still didn't answer. and even though both of them considered going upstairs and just checking on him, neither of them felt comfortable doing that. After all, the upstairs was Lance's house. It just felt like an invasion of privacy. Finally, at 10 a.m., so 2 hours after that first employee arrived, Lance's mother, who also worked at Access Inc., arrived at her son's house. She had come in through the garage, and when she entered the office and the employees told her that Lance was still not there, she said that didn't make any sense because his car was in the garage. So, the two employees waited in the office while Lance's mother went up to search the house. And for a few minutes, the two employees down in the basement heard nothing. The house was quiet. They could just hear the sound of Lance's mother walking around upstairs. But then, out of nowhere, they heard a scream. About 30 minutes later, around 10:30 a.m., Roswell police detective William Anastasio pulled up in front of a mansion that sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in a wealthy community in suburban Georgia. The only thing dispatch had told him was that someone inside of this mansion had been killed. Outside of the mansion, he could see there were police cruisers and ambulances on the street, and his sergeant and a few other investigators were standing in a cluster right near the front door. He walked over to them, and his sergeant briefed him on what they knew so far. The homeowner, Lance Herndon, had been found dead inside of his bed by his own mother after he had failed to show up for work in his basement office. There were no signs of forced entry, and the crime scene itself appeared to be contained to the master bedroom. Lance's employees had discovered that the office laptop was missing, but the rest of the house was filled with expensive electronics and jewelry that had not been touched. The sergeant told Anastasio that uniformed officers were already canvassing the neighborhood and that Anastasio should take the lead in the investigation. So Anastasio turned and walked inside the house and began going up the stairs to the master bedroom. Outside the door to the bedroom, there was a uniformed officer whose job was to make sure nobody touched anything before the crime scene techs arrived. And so Anastasio greeted him and told him he understood the protocol, but then he just stood there outside the doorway, not interfering, but looking inside, getting a first glimpse of the actual crime scene. He could see Lance's body on the bed. Lance was on his back, with his arms crossed over his chest, and he was naked. Even from a distance, Anastasio could see that whoever had killed Lance had beaten him so badly in the face that his facial bones had basically collapsed inwards. It was like someone truly bashed his head in. But, strangely, despite this, it didn't seem like there had been any sort of struggle in this room. Typically with a beating death, there was often a big fight between the victim and the assailant, which can create a very messy scene with furniture knocked over and everything messed around inside the room. But from the looks of it, it didn't seem like Lance had fought back at all. Like nothing was knocked over. He was just laying there on his back on the bed with his head caved in. And reinforcing the idea that this was not about money, Anastasio could clearly see on the dresser next to the body was a wallet, a stack of credit cards, and a folded up wad of cash. And so despite the one missing laptop, this didn't really appear to be a robbery. And so as Anastasio went back down the stairs towards the office he had been told was located in the basement, he was thinking to himself that Lance must have known his killer. This had to have been personal. In the basement office, Anastasio found a police officer standing with a small cluster of very shocked-looking women. One was Lance's grandmother, another was Lance's mother, and the other two were employees of Lance's company. Anastasio spoke with each of them one by one, and Lance's family, their general impression was they had no idea who would want to hurt Lance. Lance's mother told Anastasio that, Lance had just gone through a divorce, which could create some animosity, but he and his ex-wife had stayed on good terms, and in fact, just the night before, had had dinner together. Lance's grandmother echoed a similar sentiment that, Lance was this harmless guy, but she also had Alzheimer's and so couldn't really answer any of the questions, at least not credibly. The other two women, the employees of Lance's company, they told a slightly different story to Anastasio. They said there had been some, quote, shady people in the office recently, but when he pressed them for specifics, they said all they knew was that Lance was involved in some business disputes. Just then, a uniformed officer opened the basement door and told Anastasio he'd better get outside. The detective jogged outside, and there, at the foot of the long driveway, he saw a woman sitting in a car. The uniformed officer told him that was Lance's ex-wife, Janine. This was not what Anastasio had expected, and he would have preferred to talk to the ex-wife under more controlled circumstances, not suddenly at the crime scene. But it was also an opportunity, because it was very likely that Anastasio would be the first person to tell her that Lance was dead. And in a murder case, the ex-spouse is always a suspect, and so Anastasio wanted to see how Janine reacted to the news of her ex-husband's murder. So he walked down to her car, and as he did, Janine got out of the car looking panicked, and she told him that someone in the house had paged her. She asked what was going on, but Anastasio, without saying anything, just gestured for her to come with him to his cruiser. Once they were seated inside, he broke the news. And as he did, he carefully watched her. And Janine looked genuinely shocked. She opened and then closed her mouth like she couldn't even think of what to say, and then her eyes filled with tears. And then, in a trembling voice, she asked Anastasio what happened. But Anastasio was not ready to share anything at this point. So instead, he just asked Janine where she had been last night, and then waited to see if she got defensive or started stuttering. But she didn't do either of those things. She took a deep breath, and then told him she had actually had dinner with Lance and his family the night before, and then after that, she went home. Her new partner had come over and spent the night with her, and then that morning, she'd gotten up at 7 a.m. to head to her side job as a house cleaner, and then of course, at about 10:30, she'd received that page, and here she was. And that detail, that the ex-wife of an obviously very wealthy man was working as a cleaner, caught Anastasio's attention. He wondered if she'd still be working as a cleaner after she received whatever life insurance payout he was certain was going to come her way. But before he could ask her anything about her finances or her job, Janine blurted something out. She said, "My husband was a powerful man with a lot of enemies." By the time Detective Anastasio finished his conversation with Janine, he had gone from having 0 suspects to having 6. There was Janine herself, of course, but Anastasio had been surprised to learn that Lance had been seriously dating at least 2 other women, Kathy Collins and Dion Baugh, and that his secretary, Talana Caraway, was also a former girlfriend. This meant that Janine, Kathy, Dion, and Talana all had potential motives to want Lance dead. But Janine had actually been much more focused on the men who hated Lance. She said that Lance had always talked about business rivals being jealous of his success. And recently, he'd become embroiled in at least 2 lawsuits that Janine knew of, one with a former business partner over a hip-hop club, and the other with a contractor who said he hadn't been paid yet. Janine had heard that just yesterday, that contractor had actually shown up to a local music show looking for Lance. And when he couldn't find him, apparently he was telling people that, Lance didn't know what he was capable of, as if the contractor could, inflict harm on Lance if he didn't pay him. Anastasio was not quite sure what to think about any of this, except that he was definitely going to need a lot of DNA samples. That afternoon, Anastasio was back inside of the house, working alongside the crime scene techs who had finally arrived at about noon. And while he was doing that, 2 other women showed up at the crime scene. One of the women was Lance's secretary and former girlfriend, Talana Calloway. She said she had seen Lance the night before, and that one of his girlfriends, Dion, had kept calling for him over and over and kept leaving increasingly upset messages when he didn't answer. And these messages, Talana was fielding, and she gave them to Lance when he finally did come home. The other woman who was there with Talana was Lance's other girlfriend, Kathy Collins. But unlike Janine and Talana, Kathy didn't even try to act like she wanted to help with this investigation. Instead, she demanded to be let inside the house to go get her clothes. The uniformed officers on the scene told her that she couldn't do that because this was a crime scene, but Kathy didn't seem to care at all. And so the officers took down her name and contact info, and they also made a note that Kathy had not shed a single tear. Early the next morning, Detective Anastasio went to the medical examiner's office to observe the autopsy. He'd been at the crime scene until late, and once the crime scene techs processed everything, he'd gotten a closer look at the physical evidence, and a couple things had stood out to him. First, Lance had 3 alarm clocks, and all of them had been unplugged. And one of the alarm clocks was an analog clock, and when it was unplugged, it stopped at whatever time it was, which in this case was 4:10 a.m. And so, it was theoretically possible that perhaps the clocks began going off while the killer was still inside the house, and so they rushed over and unplugged the clocks to stop the alarm, which then put the likely time of death at or sometime before 4:10 in the morning on August 8th. Second, on the dresser, there was a framed photograph of a woman in lingerie that had been turned face down. The picture appeared to be deliberately flipped, not knocked over, as if whoever had flipped it didn't want to look at this picture. And third, inside of Lance's bedsheets were several pieces of long hair that clearly belonged to more than one woman, and there were also some short hairs as well. Now, Anastasio and the medical examiner both looked down at Lance's body. He'd apparently been hit at least 7 times in the face, with something long, heavy, and curved at the end. The medical examiner had seen wounds like this once before and thought the murder weapon could be a wrench. However, there was not a single defensive wound on Lance. He clearly had not raised his hands to stop any of the blows that his killer had rained down on him. That, combined with the fact that he'd been found naked in bed with no signs of struggle around him, suggested to Anastasio that the attack had begun when Lance was asleep. The medical examiner said that, judging from the locations of the blows and the blood spatter that he'd seen at the crime scene, the killer had likely climbed on top of Lance before they beat him to death. And this was very significant to Anastasio. On his list of suspects, he had female romantic partners and male business rivals. But whoever had killed Lance had not had to break into the house because Lance had clearly let them in, and also Lance felt comfortable enough with them to go to sleep naked near them. Then, to commit the murder, the killer had straddled Lance's chest, which was a very intimate position. And so to Anastasio, these details all combined suggested that his killer was a woman. When Detective Anastasio got back to the station, he claimed the single interview room inside the Roswell Police Headquarters and began doing interviews. He had a forensics person standing by to get hair samples and fingerprints from all his subjects to match against the crime scene. Anastasio spoke again to Lance's mother, also his ex-wife Janine, and those 2 employees who had been at the house when the body was found, and he took all their DNA. Anastasio didn't really suspect the mother or the employees, but he did have a feeling about Janine. Janine was cooperating, but she would stay on his list until he could definitively nail down her alibi and take a look at her financials. Next up was Kathy Collins, one of Lance's girlfriends who had shown up at the crime scene totally distraught about her clothing. And the moment she sat down in the chair in the interview room, Anastasio recognized her as the woman in that downturned photograph on Lance's dresser. And when Anastasio began asking questions, he sort of half expected her to again ask about her clothes. But instead, Kathy laid out what Anastasio had to admit was a pretty good alibi. Kathy said she had been out of town at a family funeral and had arrived back in Roswell on August 7th in the evening along with her niece. She and her niece had gotten dinner at a restaurant close to Lance's house and had stayed there until about maybe 10:30 or 11 p.m. She then gave Anastasio a receipt from a gas station that was in another state, along with the tab from the restaurant to back these details up. Although Anastasio noted that she and her niece had only eaten $7 worth of food, which seemed very light for how long they had been there. However, Anastasio knew that, Lance was not killed while Kathy and her niece were allegedly at this restaurant on August 7th. Instead, he was very likely killed in the early morning hours of August 8th, likely around 4:10 a.m. But Kathy said, she had spent the entire night on August 7th into August 8th with her other romantic partner. She said that she and Lance had never really been all that monogamous. In fact, when they met, both of them were married. So when Anastasio asked Kathy if it was possible that Lance might have been thinking about breaking up with her, she just shrugged and said they really weren't that close anymore. She told Anastasio she'd be happy to provide DNA samples and fingerprints because she didn't kill him. Before she got up to leave, Kathy told Anastasio there was one more thing. She said about a month earlier, some woman had come to Lance's home in the middle of the night, freaking out so loudly that Lance had actually called the police. If the police were thinking one of Lance's girlfriends killed him, Kathy said they should start by finding that woman. When the door closed behind Kathy, Anastasio smiled, because a record search had already turned up the police report for the incident Kathy was talking about. And that woman, the girlfriend, was Dion Baugh, who was already on her way down to the station. When Dion arrived, she took a seat inside the interview room, and right away, Anastasio began drilling her with questions. And immediately, he was suspicious. First of all, Dion's demeanor was very strange. She kept giggling every time she was asked a question. Now, Anastasio knew that likely she was just nervous, and so that by itself was not proof of guilt, but it certainly didn't help her credibility. Second, Dion herself was carrying on multiple romantic relationships, just like Lance. And third, perhaps the most suspicious out of all of it, Dion admitted right up front that she had Lance's missing laptop, as well as one of his credit cards. And in fact, she had charged $2,700 worth of furniture on it the same night that Lance was murdered. Suddenly, Dion Baugh was Anastasio's #1 suspect. And so the detective leaned forward in his chair and asked Dion where she'd been from the evening of August 7th to the morning of August 8th. And her alibi was very weak. She said she had been at home, without her husband or her daughter, who were visiting family. In fact, Dion said there was no one who could confirm this for her. But Dion insisted that she hadn't murdered Lance. She said that Lance did a lot of good stuff for her. He had bought her a beautiful Mercedes car, and he gave her hundreds of dollars in cash every week, plus the use of his credit cards. And then she asked the detective, why would she be so stupid as to make a giant purchase with one of those credit cards on the same night that he was killed? It would be so suspicious. She also said he lent her his laptop all the time for school, and any of his employees could confirm that. Dion said that on August 7th, she had called Lance repeatedly, but he never answered. And then on August 8th, the day his body was found, he was supposed to go with her to court to help her clear the charge she had picked up on the night a month earlier when he had called the cops on her for coming to his home acting crazy. But he hadn't shown up in court. She said she'd been so angry and called him repeatedly throughout the day to see why he blew her off, but he never answered on the 8th. Of course, she said now she knew why. It was because he was dead. Dion offered Anastasio her phone records. She said she would give DNA samples and her fingerprints. And then she told him she really hoped he solved the case soon because she was afraid. She said that Lance was always paying people to do his dirty work, and until detectives caught his killer, she was going to be looking over her shoulder in case maybe they came for her too. Anastasio would spend the next couple of weeks trying to run down the alibis of every single person and their significant others who might have wanted Lance Herndon dead. It was a long list. Some people the detective did feel ready to rule out. Lance's ex-wife, Janine Herndon, for example, had a solid alibi confirmed by her new partner. And although she would have been the recipient, along with her son, of Lance's life insurance policy, she was already receiving a good amount of money from Lance monthly in the form of alimony and child support. And so Lance was worth more to her alive than dead. And then there were Lance's various business rivals, and they turned out to be very weak suspects, primarily because they all had alibis. Plus, it just seemed very unlikely that Lance would have, let these business rivals into his home late at night without some sort of confrontation. But as the investigation wore on, other suspects who Anastasio had also been ready to write off started behaving in ways that made them look more suspicious, not less. Kathy Collins, for example, who was really bent out of shape about not getting her clothes back, had supplied a more or less rock-solid alibi, plus DNA and fingerprints. But 6 days after the murder, she had sent a demand letter to the police station listing off every item she had left inside of Lance's home, down to her sunglasses, perfume, and a bottle of wine, asking for all of it back immediately. It was an outrageously cold move from somebody who should have been at least a little sad about Lance's death. And then there was Talana Caraway, the girlfriend turned secretary/platonic friend. On the day Lance's body was found, she had come to Lance's home because she said she wanted to help. That action could be viewed either as proof that she had nothing to hide, or as inserting herself into the investigation and offering distractions from her own guilt. And after that first day, when she'd been so willing to talk and cooperate, now she had clammed up. Another detective on Anastasio's team had gone to her house to ask some follow-up questions, and she had refused to come to the door at all. Then she'd shown up at the police station with her own lawyer. And that wasn't all. The only thing police had learned during their canvass of the neighborhood on the first day of the investigation was that apparently somebody had been spotted driving through the neighborhood in a light blue car at about 4:40 a.m. This timeline matched up with the ballpark time of death of 4:10 a.m., and the vehicle description matched Talana's own car. However, apparently people thought they saw a man driving that car at 4:40 a.m. And so after learning this, Anastasio did some digging, and he discovered that Talana's partner, Jazz, owed Lance money, and that Jazz had a criminal record. And so while Anastasio doubted that Jazz could have on his own just walked his way into Lance's house, he did think it was quite possible that Talana could get inside and then maybe open the door for Jazz. Finally, there was Dion Baugh, the woman who had shown up at Lance's house and acted crazy and had police called on her. Of all of Lance's girlfriends, her alibi was absolutely the weakest, and her level of anger and outrage at Lance was definitely the highest. Also, she literally had Lance's missing computer and one of his credit cards. But as the days ticked by, Anastasia was realizing that none of the details surrounding Dion were smoking guns. Dion's phone records confirmed her story about making repeated calls to Lance, and Lance's other employees confirmed that Dion did sometimes borrow his laptop. That was normal. And Lance's banking information showed that throughout his entire relationship with Dion, he spent tons of money on her. And so the idea that she would buy, $2,700 of furniture on the night of his murder looked suspicious, but actually appeared to be pretty typical. Dion had willingly given DNA and fingerprints, and the police had matched 3 of the hairs found in Lance's bed to Dion, but they'd also found 13 other hairs that didn't belong to Dion, Lance, or any of the other women they knew Lance had slept with. And since Dion had already admitted to sleeping with Lance in his bed not long before the murder, the hairs really weren't proof of anything Anastasio didn't already know. Detective Anastasio still didn't have the murder weapon either. Now, the medical examiner had guessed that Lance was killed with a wrench, and after interviewing Lance's housekeeper, police had discovered that a wrench was missing from Lance's home. But a missing murder weapon couldn't give any fingerprints. And so far, none of the women that Anastasio had collected prints from had matched prints found in Lance's bedroom. And so within about a month of Lance's murder, the case that had seemed so hot on that first day was now going cold. More than a year would pass, and in that time, Detective Anastasio would continue to investigate Lance Herndon's murder, but he really didn't make any progress. He stayed in touch with the prosecutor, with both of them hoping that some new lead would turn up, but all their evidence had gotten them nowhere. And so between business rivals, romantic partners, and romantic partners' significant others, it felt like this murder could have plausibly been committed by at least 10 different people. That was until January of 1998, when the prosecutor who had been working with Anastasio got a phone call. And on this call, the caller told them that Lance's killer was currently involved in a heated divorce case, and during arguments for that case, the killer had destroyed their own alibi for the night of Lance's murder. Now, it had been 17 months at this point since Lance had been killed, but the prosecutor was still skeptical that the killer would really be so sloppy as to present evidence to a different court that went against what they'd already told local police. But then, later that month, the prosecutor went to the divorce trial to watch for himself, and there, everything came together. Based on evidence and interviews conducted during an investigation that spanned a year and a half, this is what police believe happened to Lance Herndon in the early morning hours of August 8, 1996. The killer lay in bed next to Lance, listening to him breathe. And as they did, a feeling of rage grew in the killer's chest. Lance was just lying there, peacefully sleeping, with no care in the world for how badly he was hurting the killer. Lance didn't know that the killer knew he had lied to them. Lance had fallen asleep thinking that he had the killer fooled, but Lance was wrong, and the killer couldn't stand it any longer. And so they slipped out of bed and headed downstairs, where they retrieved the wrench they had seen on a countertop earlier. Then, with the weapon in hand, they went back into the master bedroom, got back in bed, and climbed right on top of Lance, straddling him. Then, while Lance slept peacefully right in front of them, the killer raised the wrench up and then brought it down on his face so hard that Lance was instantly knocked unconscious. And so Lance did nothing as the killer repeatedly smashed the wrench into Lance's face over and over again until his skull literally caved in and Lance was dead. After the frenzy, the killer climbed off of Lance and cleaned themselves up. Lance's alarm clocks began going off, and the killer panicked and just unplugged them all. Then they put back on their clothes and hurried downstairs. But the killer did not leave right away. Instead, they first went down to Lance's home office and made sure to take his laptop computer with them, something they had checked before they decided to kill him. Because the killer was Dion Baugh, one of Lance's many girlfriends. And one thing inside of that laptop helped explain her motive. It was Lance's daily calendar, which he had always updated so meticulously to keep his appointments and his girlfriends straight. But officials said Dion killed Lance in part because of the one thing he had not put into his calendar, which was her court appearance, scheduled for the morning of August 8th. Lance had promised to go to court with her on that day to help her clear the charge she'd picked up for coming to his home in the middle of the night a month earlier. But Lance's calendar for August 8th was completely empty. Lance had no intention of going, and Dion knew it. To Dion, this was an unforgivable betrayal, and so she bludgeoned Lance to death. Dion ultimately incriminated herself during her divorce trial by telling the court she had actually gone to Lance's house on August 7th, hours before he was killed. Remember, she had told police at the time that she had not done that and she was home alone the whole time, was never at his house. And so when the prosecutor who sat in on the divorce trial actually heard her testimony, which directly contradicted her alibi that she had given, he had her arrested as soon as she left the courthouse. Ultimately, Dion pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She was released in 2011. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hey guys, welcome back to the official MrBallen Campfire. Tonight I have two awesome stories to tell you. They are both of the strange variety. In both stories, we're going to talk about a tragedy, but it is not the tragedy that is the reason we remember these things. We remember these events, or we still talk about these events, because in both stories, there are elements that just nobody can fully explain. There are truly unexplained phenomena that are fascinating, that are terrifying, and I know you're going to love it. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and replace all of their shoelaces with 20-foot long shoelaces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. Just before 10 a.m. on November 14, 1995, a 19-year-old man named Zhang ran down a dark street toward a bus stop on the outskirts of Beijing, which is the capital city of China. Zhang, who worked at a fast food restaurant, had gotten off work late, and so now he had to catch this bus because it was the last one out of the area, and if he missed it, he'd be stranded. So this area where Zhang worked was actually a pretty historic district in Beijing. It was home to several old palaces and shrines that were built at the foot of this mountain called Baiwang Mountain. And so this area was sort of like a popular tourist area. And so during the day, it was very busy. There was lots of cabs coming in and out of the area. But at night, it was basically deserted and no cabs came through here. So again, the bus really was his only shot of getting out here, unless he wanted to walk on foot, and that was just not practical. And so Zhang continued running along until he turned the corner, and up ahead he saw the bus stop, and he didn't see the bus. It was just basically a deserted street, but standing near the bus stop was this old woman, and it appeared like she was waiting for the bus, which suggested to Zhang that he had not missed the final bus, because clearly she was waiting for it too, unless she also missed it perhaps, but it just seemed like she hadn't. And so Zhang, who by this point is like kind of out of breath, he stopped running and he walked the last distance up to the bus stop where this woman was. And as he approached her, she kind of turned and looked at him like, who are you? You know, it's late at night. She's all alone. You know, it's just kind of weird. But she looked at him and he kind of just smiled at her to signal like, I'm no threat. You know, I'm just here for the bus too. And then before the two could even talk, Zhang heard the sound of a bus approaching. And he turned and here comes bus 375. It came to a stop. The old woman climbed on, and Zhang followed up right after her. A moment later, Zhang was inside the bus. The doors had closed behind him. The driver had taken off from the curb. Zhang had paid the ticket seller, who was separate from the driver, sitting in sort of the front right seat. And the woman who had been in front of him, she also had paid. She had sat down in the row right next to the ticket seller, right behind the driver. And Zhang, even though the whole bus was empty, nobody else is on here except for these three people, he just sat down right behind the old woman. So he takes his seat, you know, they're driving down the road and, you know, it's late at night, he's tired, he's had a long shift. And so for a little while, Zhang just looked out the window and watched all the, you know, imperial gardens and the shrines and all the various landmarks that drew people to the area. You know, this was again sort of a touristy area. He's just watching it all pass by. You know, it's late, it's dark, he can't see much out there. But eventually, you know, relatively soon after they had started, they passed by sort of all the touristy stuff and they entered into this stretch of road that Zhang was very familiar with. He took bus 375 home all the time. That, you know, this stretch was very desolate. There was no more buildings, no more anything. It was just kind of forest and wild on either side of the road. And so as a result, at night, driving this desolate stretch was very, very dark. There was just literally no lights. And so once they were in this sort of desolate stretch, Zhang found himself just kind of leaning back and closing his eyes because it was a little bit of a ride before he'd get to his stop and get off the bus. And so he just closed his eyes and he's trying to kind of nod off. And they're driving for a little while and he kind of felt himself beginning to fall asleep when suddenly he felt the bus start to slow down. Now, there was no indication within the bus that anything had happened. Zhang knew that it was way too early to be at the next bus stop. And so immediately he opened his eyes and he's just kind of looking around for some cue from the driver or the ticket seller or even this woman, like what was going on here. But then the bus came to a full stop and it's so dark outside that Zhang like literally can't see what's going on out there. And no one's saying anything. And the driver just kind of inexplicably gets up from his seat and he walks out of the bus. Like he exits the bus, which was odd. Like there's no clear reason for this. And so Zhang, the woman, even the ticket seller, they're kind of just like peering out the window, out the front window of the bus to see what's going on. But given how dark it was outside and the fact that there was really only light inside the bus, it had the effect of just kind of making all the interior glass of the bus be sort of reflective, like really difficult to look out. Imagine sitting inside of a dark room with a light and being surrounded by glass. It'd be impossible to look out at. All you would see was like a mirror effect all around you. And so for a minute, Zhang and the others are just kind of like wondering what's happening. What did the driver see? And then Zhang heard something outside the bus that sounded like people talking, or maybe he thought it was people talking. And so he pressed his face up to the glass and put his hands up to it to see if he could cut through that sort of mirror effect to see what was going on out there. And at first it was just darkness. He couldn't see anything. But eventually his eyes adjusted, and on his side of the bus, on the road, the driver clearly was interacting with what looked like multiple people, like 2, maybe even 3 people that are down there. There didn't appear to be, you know, any other vehicle. Like it just wasn't clear what was happening, but there was definitely people outside of the bus. And so Zhang and the others, no one's talking. They're all just kind of trying to make sense of what's happening. And then before anybody could ask any questions, the driver comes back on the bus, sits down in the driver's seat, and then behind him come these 3 new people who presumably were the same people the driver was speaking to outside the bus. They also are likely the reason the driver stopped in the first place, although again, it's very unclear why they stopped in the first place. Like there's no reason to be stopping here, but you know, Zhang at this point just wants to get home. He doesn't really care. But these three people, they come on board the bus, and immediately Zhang and the woman and the ticket seller, they're all looking at them like, what's going on here? So there were three men, and they were all wearing these traditional silk robes. There were two in blue, and there was one in red. And the two men in blue were like physically holding up the third man in red, almost like he couldn't stand on his own. Like picture somebody who was like really intoxicated, like he couldn't quite stand. But immediately Zhang clocked that this guy didn't look drunk or something. He looked hurt. Like he was covered in mud and like grime, as if he had been like rolling around on the ground or something, or maybe he had fallen or whatever. Like it wasn't clear, but something happened to this guy. And the two guys in blue, who their robes are pristine, they're holding this guy up, and they kind of bring him into the bus, and then without saying anything to these people on the bus, they just kind of dragged this man, who was conscious, but again, barely able to stand, down the aisle, past Zhang, past the others, to the back of the bus, where they took their seat. And then it was like nobody said anything. The driver didn't acknowledge how bizarre this whole thing was. He just pulled away and started driving. And then before long, it's like Zhang is just sitting there, really unclear, like what's even happening. But as they're driving along, he just felt so uncomfortable. The woman right in front of him, she had gone, back to looking straight ahead. She's not paying attention to what's happening behind her. Same with the ticket seller. But Zhang, he just felt really uncomfortable. And specifically what he felt was, it just seemed like the three guys in the back, the silk robe guys, one, they were completely silent, eerily silent. And two, it just felt like Zhang, it was almost like he could feel them staring at him. Not just looking straight ahead towards the front of the bus, but it was like they were looking at him. It was like a primal sense that Zhang had. And the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became, and frankly, the more fearful he became. Like it was like every little noise behind him was like confirmation that they were like looking at him, or maybe moving up the aisle to get closer to him. But he couldn't bring himself to turn around and look. It was like he was terrified of what he was going to see behind him. And so he just stayed glued to his seat, rigidly looking straight ahead. But again, it was like this whole ride, he's just like, they're staring at me, something is off, like what's going on with these guys? And it went on and on for like 10, 15 minutes of just this really tense ride. But despite how sort of awful this ride had become, even though he couldn't fully articulate exactly why it was just so uncomfortable, despite all that, Zhang is thinking, any minute now, we're going to get to my stop, I'm going to get off the stupid bus, and this is going to be over and done with, and I'll forget all about this stuff. But before they reached his stop, while they're still in this sort of isolated part of the ride where it's very dark outside, Zhang, who again is just sort of glued, looking straight ahead, he notices the woman right in front of him, who this whole time has seemingly completely forgot about the guys behind her. Like she's just looking straight ahead, no big deal. She just all of a sudden turns around and looks towards the back of the bus. Just one fluid motion. She just turned and looked. And Zhang, he's staring at the woman as she does this. And he watches as her face goes from, curious and just sort of normal to her eyes going wide. And she stands up and she just starts screaming and pointing towards the back of the bus. And then before Zhang can turn around himself, and he's still too scared to even look, he feels something smack into the side of his head, and so he's like disoriented. It hits him again and again, and he realizes it's the woman who's screaming at whatever's happening in the back of the bus, and she's hitting him over and over again with her purse, and she's yelling something, and Zhang's like, what is going on? He's realizing she's screaming, thief, at Zhang. She's hitting him in the head, screaming thief. He's got no clue why. He doesn't know why she's yelling at whatever's happening in the back. And before long, the bus driver just stops the bus, and without even asking what's going on, he just looks at Zhang and just gestures, get off the bus. As if Zhang is like the central issue on this bus. Not the strange people we've picked up 20 minutes ago that no one has any explanation for. No explanation for why this woman is screaming about whatever they're doing back there. The bus driver has just decided that Zhang is the issue. And Zhang, at this point, does just want to get off the bus. He doesn't want to be here. And so without even looking at the back, he just got up, no questions asked, breezed past the woman who's still hitting him with her bag, and out the door he goes. He didn't care. He knew he had a long walk home, but anything was better than being in that bus.
Now, once Zhang actually got off the bus, he realized he actually was not in as bad of a spot as he could have been. Like, he expected to get off and basically be in the middle of nowhere because he knew they were in this sort of isolated area. But when he got off, he realized they had sort of just came to the end of that isolated section. And so pretty nearby, he could see a neighborhood, which meant he actually was not that far away from his home. And so he's thinking, okay, I got a bit of a walk, but again, thank goodness I'm not on that bus. I don't even want to think about what's happening on that crazy bus. Like, thank goodness I'm just out of there. And so Zhang, he just starts walking towards his home and he's making his way when he hears something behind him. And he immediately stops because think about how traumatic whatever just happened was for him. He can't process what's happened. It's this totally crazy, inexplicable thing. He's on the side of the road now, like he's on edge. And so he hears something behind him and he just stops. And this time, unlike on the bus, he does turn around to see what's going on. And he turns and he sees he's not alone. Standing behind him on the sidewalk is the old woman. And she's staring right at him. And so Zhang, he's looking at her and immediately he clocks that like something's different about her. On the bus, that expression she had on her face when she screamed at whatever was in the back of the bus and then began hitting him with her purse, that expression she had was like fear and paranoia and even anger. That's what he saw on her face. But now she's like smiling and she's looking at him with this almost like I'm sorry look on her face. Like please, I want to talk to you about what just happened. Like she was signaling to him like we need to talk. And so picking up on that, Zhang, like he wanted to just go over to her and be like, what are you doing? Like, why did you do that to me? I didn't take anything from you. Like he wanted to yell at her. But again, there was just that look on her face that said like, I got to go talk to this woman. And so Zhang, he turns and he walks to this woman and he says to her like, what happened on there? Like, what's going on? Like, what did you see? What happened? And she looked at him and she was like, I have to tell you a secret. So that night, unbeknownst to Zhang and very likely unbeknownst to this woman, this bus they were on, bus 375, after they got off, it would take off and drive off with its strange occupants on board. And believe it or not, the bus would vanish. It would just go missing. Nobody knew where it went. And then 3 days later, it was found crashed in a reservoir 60 miles north of where Zhang and this woman had gotten off. And on board the bus were 3 dead bodies. It was the driver, the ticket seller, and then also the man wearing red, the guy who was needing to be propped up by the other 2 men in blue. Now, authorities made no mention of the men in blue. It was just these 3 people were found on board the bus. Now, it was determined that all 3 of them had died from a broken neck. And so the running assumption was the crash itself caused them to break their necks, and that's what killed them. But there was a very strange determination about the condition of the bodies. So the occupants on board the bus presumably died within 72 hours because that's the time frame they were missing and when they were found dead. But it was determined that their bodies were so decomposed they likely had been dead for months. The secret that the old woman told Zhang was that when she turned around on the bus and she looked to the back and she saw the men, she said the men in blue were staring at Zhang with just a look of pure evil on their face. She was like, I knew it wasn't right. These were evil spirits and they were after Zhang. It was like she instinctively just knew it. She didn't know why, she just knew it. And almost like reflexively, she began screaming. And then it was like this thought crossed her mind that she needed to save Zhang. And the first thing she thought to do was accuse him of being a thief so the bus driver would stop and kick him off the bus. And so she put on this performance, hitting him, calling him a thief, basically to save him, to get him off the bus away from what she thought were literally evil spirits. And so think about this. She's telling Zhang this on the side of the road. They're in the middle of nowhere. Their ride is pulling away. Zhang wasn't like, oh boy, thank you so much for saving me from the evil spirits on the bus. He's like, okay, I get it now. I guess I appreciate it. And then the 2 of them just took off on their merry way. It wasn't until 3 days later that Zhang realized whatever caused her to have that reaction literally saved his life. And who knows who the men in blue were? because something happened on that bus. Something caused it to vanish and then crash into the reservoir, and everybody dies on board with their necks broken and their bodies decomposed more than they should be. Like, none of that makes any sense. But all Zhang knows is because of that woman, he was still alive. And so Zhang is like a mix between terrified that he was involved in this, but also so thankful that this woman saved his life. But what he did when he put it all together, when he found out about this bus and, what happened on board, the dead bodies and all that, he went to the authorities and he said there were 2 other people on the bus that were acting so weird, the men in blue, the ones the woman basically warned him about being these evil spirits. And he told the authorities. And, whether or not they bought the evil spirit line didn't really matter. What they're being told is there were 2 people acting strange on the bus before this all happened. And they went out and they looked for the 2 men in blue. And they never found them. No one has any idea who they were. And so to this day, all the locals all say to never take the last bus ride along Route 375. On a fall afternoon in 1887, a man named Gene Wilson rode his horse next to the Platte River in Wyoming, herding some cattle that were grazing there. Next to him was Gene's dog, who was running along dutifully right behind him and sort of nipping at the cows' heels to keep them in line. So Gene was a ranch hand, and he worked for a ranch in the town of Casper, which was about maybe 10 miles away from where he was right now. And part of Gene's responsibilities was going out and finding lost cattle that wandered too far from the ranch and herding them back to the pasture. So on this particular day, the weather was perfect, it's sunny, it's beautiful, and generally Gene actually really enjoyed this aspect of his job. Like, he liked being out here. But today, even though he should have been like, this is a great day, he just felt really, really tired. He had worked many, many hours up until this point, and he really just wanted to be done and head back home to where he lived with his wife. They had this little house that was sort of tucked away in this secluded area in this valley surrounded by hills. It was like his oasis. Gene and his wife were like absolute best friends, like the very best part of his day, even on days where he went out and enjoyed his job. Still, the best part of his day was always returning home and just catching up with his wife over dinner. That was like the thing he looked forward to the most. And so right now it was like he craved just being home and being with his wife. He could not wait. But Gene, he was a diligent guy, and he just continued doing his job. He's trotting along the river, he's herding the cows. And at some point, as he's sort of at this point mindlessly doing his job, because again, he doesn't want to be here anymore, he looks down and he notices his dog is no longer next to him. His dog was always right next to him, helping, doing the herding, and his dog's not there. And so he stopped and he began looking around, and that's when he realized that maybe because he was becoming so mindless doing this job today, that this huge amount of mist had sort of rolled out over the Platte River. Like, he hadn't noticed that there was just all this mist. And as he's looking out, seeing this massive cloud of mist, he noticed his dog. And his dog was actually kind of going nuts. The dog had broken off and run to the edge of the Platte River, and it was sort of like barking like mad. And it had been for some time. It was like Gene just hadn't noticed it. And so he's seeing the mist and he's seeing his dog, and he's like, what's going on over here? He can't see anything on the river. This is a usually pretty well-traveled river, but there hadn't been any traffic, no boats or anything. And so it's a quiet day, but it's like he can't see anything out on the river. The dog is just going crazy. And so Gene's like, what's going on? What's out over there? And this is also like very unusual behavior for his dog. Like, his dog was very well trained. This is an odd thing for it to be doing. But, Gene's thinking there's got to be a good reason for it. The dog wouldn't do this for no reason. And so Gene, he lets the cattle just continue making their way along the river, but he, on his horse, he turns and begins making his way over to the dog, who again is sort of stationary by the river's edge, barking and looking out at something in the middle of this mist, presumably. However, as Gene trotted his way towards the dog, the horse began to react to something. Gene's horse began to react to something that Gene couldn't even see. It started to get really scared. It was whinnying and sort of unwilling to go any further. And then finally, when Gene really tried to get the horse to carry on here, the horse actually reared onto its back legs and almost kicked Gene off of it. Gene managed to hold on, and when the horse came back down on all fours, he just calmed the horse down and brought it over to a nearby tree. The whole time, the dog is still barking like crazy, looking at something out over the water. And so now Gene's like, what is going on here? He gets off his horse and he ties it to a tree, and then on foot, he walks over to his dog. And so he walks over to his dog's, yapping and barking, and as soon as Gene is next to his dog stops barking, but it continues to be really fixated on the water, which again is like utterly covered by mist. He can't see anything out on the water. It's quiet, like eerily quiet. The mist is almost obscuring the sunlight at this point. It's almost like they're inside of a cloud, and it's just him and his dog. The dog is fixated on something, and Gene's looking out over the water. And then all of a sudden, it was like the mist began to part, and this enormous, like way bigger than he had ever seen on the Platte River, this huge wooden ship suddenly comes into view. And so right away, Gene is sort of baffled by the ship. Number one, it seemed fairly obvious that this is the thing that his dog was barking at. And it might have been the same thing that the horse was reacting to, but Gene's like, why? There are ships that go up and down this river all the time. The dog, the horse, they don't react this way to any of those ships. What's that about? But more than that, this ship really was just enormous. Like, looked out of place. It was so big. And this is not a particularly deep river. And so Gene's like, how is this big of a ship here? And so Gene's almost like fascinated with what he's looking at. He's sort of not really worried about the dog anymore, or the horse, or even his cattle. He's looking at the ship, wondering what in the heck it's doing here. Like, whose ship is this? And so Gene continues to watch as the ship, continues just slowly making its way down Platte River. And as he's staring at it, again, just sort of fascinated by it, he counts 9 sailors on the deck, moving around, doing something on the deck. But what they were doing on the deck just wasn't immediately clear. They weren't doing sort of obvious sailor things. They were clearly working on something in unison on the deck. There was something they were doing all together. Like there was this apparent huge tarp almost that sat in the middle of the deck of the ship, and they were sort of moving it around, and it appeared like there was something underneath it, but Gene couldn't see it, and he was too far away to make out what it could be. And so Gene is he's staring at this crew, he's looking at the ship, and then all of a sudden, all 9 of the sailors on board the ship, almost like in unison, just stopped what they were doing, and they turned, and they all at the exact same time just stared directly at Gene. And it sort of like disarmed Gene. Like he was really, staring intently at them. It was like alarming to have them all be looking at him all at once. And so he's sort of taken aback, and he's looking out at them like, are they looking at me? What did I do? What's going on here? And then all at once, these 9 people, they go back to what they're doing, and they begin to lift up this tarp, right? So they're revealing what's underneath it. And now, Gene, he's both terrified and sort of confused and still just fascinated. And he's looking out like, what are they going to reveal? Like, this is so weird. And the tarp comes up. And at first, all Gene could see was like this weird mound, like a black mound sitting on the deck of the ship that was underneath this tarp. But as he continued to stare, he suddenly realized what he was looking at, it couldn't be possible. Like, how could that be out? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And he was horrified. He was scared, and he's thinking like, I don't even know what to do. And all of a sudden, he grabs his dog, he runs back to his horse, and he thinks, I have to get home. I have to get home right now. And so on his horse he goes, he just gets his dog, he abandons the cattle. From what he's seen, he doesn't even care. He has to make sure that everything back home is okay. And he takes off. He starts galloping as fast as he can back in the direction of that quaint little home he's got down in the hillside. And so over an hour of riding, basically at full tilt, he finally crests the hill, and by this point, he's tried to convince himself that what he saw on board that ship could not have been a real thing. But he goes up the hill that looks down into the valley where he would normally first see his home. Except when he looked down into the valley, his home wasn't there anymore. His home was just this smoldering black ruin. The home had burned down, apparently in the last few hours while he was gone. And so Gene is a mixture of horrified, but also weirdly not surprised, and he blazes down the hill. He gets to what remains of his home, and he sees that's not all. he sees there is a black mound that looked just like the mound he saw on board that ship that is laying on the ground not far from where his house was. And it's the body of his wife. That's what he saw out on the ship. He saw the dead body of his wife burned and destroyed, but it was definitely her. He could make her out from here. It scared him so bad he went back to check, and now he's seeing it in real life. Now, of course, for all you folks who are hearing this story, you're going to think, come on, like this happened in the 1800s. Like how much of this is really true? What, he looked out and he saw a ghost ship appear with a premonition or a vision of his wife who he's going to find dead? Sure, right? Well, listen to this. So after Gene finds his dead wife, he has this incredible story about how he sort of knew about it beforehand by seeing this ghost ship, if you will. And so he went and told people. He told a lot of people about what happened. And eventually, a few years later, his story found its way to a journalist named Vincent Gaddis. And Vincent Gaddis happened to have done all this extensive reporting about the infamous Bermuda Triangle, which is just off the coast of Bermuda. There's this section of the ocean where all this very strange activity has been reported over many, many years. Like stuff that is basically paranormal in nature consistently is reported in this part of the world. And so he had done a lot of research on the Bermuda Triangle. And so he's primed to hear stories like Gene's story and take them seriously. And so when he heard about Gene's story, he began looking into it. And Vincent pretty much immediately discovered that there was absolutely no record of this enormous ship being on the Platte River. In fact, as Vincent found, it would have been impossible for a ship of that size, as Gene described, this 100-foot ship, being able to travel on the Platte River. It was too shallow. So there was no record, and it seemed impossible. And so the way Vincent responded to this is, okay, well, clearly, Gene is a man who's been racked by guilt and shame. He feels probably like he somehow let his wife down by going out that day, and she winds up dying in this fire. And so this is a man who's just dealing with grief. And it's his grief that has somehow created this story in his mind to explain what happened to his wife. It seems crazy, but people do crazy things when they are really deeply affected by grief. However, many years later, that same journalist wound up finding out that actually Gene was not the only person who had a story like this. He discovered that apparently 25 years before Gene's story and then 16 years after Gene's story, there were these two other people who specifically reported seeing this enormous ship on the Platte River that apparently had the dead body of one of their loved ones on board, and like all the sailors are looking out at them and they're like showing them this dead body, but that person that they're seeing was alive as far as these people thought. But then when they went home, they discovered that their loved ones were in fact dead. It was the same as Gene's story. In the years since these sightings, this ship has become known as the Death Ship, and it's widely considered to be a death omen, both in the Platte River Valley and also throughout Wyoming.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Acasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Our two stories today are both about people who believed in something so strongly that it informed every single choice they made. And unfortunately for them, those choices led them down very dangerous paths. But before we get into today's two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button sneezes in public, instead of, politely saying, bless you, just scream, shut up! Okay, let's get into our first story called The Search for Akakor. One afternoon in November of 1980, 28-year-old John Reed sat at a table on a hotel veranda in the tiny village of Barcelos, Brazil, which was a 2-day boat ride up a river from the Amazon jungle's largest city of Manaus. And sitting across from John was the legendary chief of the Uga Mongolula tribe, Tatunka Nara. Now, John had been in Barcelos for about 10 days now, and in that time, he'd already spoken to Tatunka many times. But still, it was like every conversation they had gave John this incredible sense of awe. He really felt like his whole life had been leading up to this exact moment of being here in Barcelos, about to go on this grand adventure. So Barcelos and Tatunka were very far away from where John had grown up. I mean, this was a very foreign place. John grew up in San Francisco, California. But even growing up in those suburbs as a kid, he had always dreamed of coming here and literally meeting Tatunka. So it was like surreal he had really done this. And if things from here on out went the way John hoped they would, he might never have to even go back to America. Because John was on a bona fide quest. John was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Akakor. Now, there was almost no record of the city ever actually existing, except for in one book called The Chronicle of Akakor, which was by this author and journalist named Carl Brugger. Carl wrote that Akakor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization, similar to the Incas or ancient Egyptians, in that they'd lived thousands of years ago and had a big empire and an extremely advanced civilization for their time. But according to Carl, Akakor and its people were way better because they were descendants from actual gods. When the Europeans eventually came to the Amazonian jungle, the people of Akakor did not get wiped out because they went underground. And it was there, underground, that they rebuilt their capital and literally hid their civilization from the modern world. And in fact, the legend said that they actually still live there now, guarding a treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Now, most people called Carl's book complete fiction and said that its author just sort of made it up to make money. But John hadn't paid any attention to the naysayers, and any possible doubts that he had completely disappeared the moment he'd finally met Tatunka. So Tatunka was not only a famous chief who knew the Amazon like the back of his hand, but more importantly, at least to John, he'd actually been interviewed in Carl's book, and he was said to be the one known person who'd actually been to Akakor who was still alive. And here Tatunka was, in the flesh, sitting across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a loincloth, and he had that same turtle tattoo that the book described, so John knew he was the guy, he was the chief he'd been looking for. And to John, if Tatunka was real, well then surely everything else in that book was real too. Right now though, neither John nor Tatunka were saying anything. which was unusual because normally their meetings were very animated, as Tatunka regaled John with all these amazing stories about Akakor and what it was like there in his very heavily accented English. But hearing these stories hadn't been enough for John, who really wanted to know where Akakor actually was so that he could actually see it with his own eyes. Now, so far, Tatunka had not told John where it was. He'd said that the people of Akakor wanted to stay hidden. Their survival depended on it, and so he was not going to give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different. Because just a few minutes ago, John had asked Tatunka again about literally going to Akakor, and now Tatunka had been very quiet for a very long time, like he was thinking about whether or not to finally reveal its location. And so John patiently waited. And as he sat there in this really intense silence, it was like he could almost feel Tatunka's deep wisdom oozing off of him in waves. And then finally, in his soft, very fragmented English, Tatunka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on an evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, 35-year-old Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her San Francisco area home and got out of her car to check the mailbox. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and bleary-eyed as she, reached into the box and sort of mindlessly pulled out a stack of mail. But as she began sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop. It was a letter that was postmarked from Germany, and Sandy didn't know anybody who lived in Germany. And so she really wasn't sure what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective who said that he was writing about her brother, John, and that they were sure something bad had happened to him. So John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find the lost civilization of Akakor, and Sandy and her parents hadn't heard from him since he left. Now, during the first few weeks of John's trip, he'd written letters fairly regularly, but then his last message had come in late 1980, and after that, nothing. Now, of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother, but she also hadn't been that surprised he had gone radio silent, because Sandy and her parents were well aware that John was obsessed with Akakor, and not just that, he wanted to go on this adventure, find this lost city in the jungle, and then never come home. He wanted to stay in the jungle. And so they kind of figured that, maybe he found Akakor, or maybe he just found another village somewhere. But either way, the way they looked at it is John likely wanted to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere in the jungle, and that's probably what he had done. So for nearly a decade, that sort of became their line of thinking. But now, as Sandy is reading this letter, it was like suddenly her understanding of what was going on with her brother was totally and instantly fractured. Now she was both panicked and also totally confused about the idea that, one, John was in trouble, and two, why is the German police looking for her brother? Why is that happening? Why aren't American police looking for my brother? But as her eyes frantically scanned the page, she learned why. The detective said they were investigating the death or disappearance of John and at least 3 other people, including a German citizen, who apparently had been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Akakor. Now, this book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication. Akakor, not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was killing the people who came looking for it. Now, the detective said they had tried to investigate, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative, and he wasn't actually allowed to go to Brazil to collect evidence to try to figure out what happened here. And so basically, he was stuck, but he wanted her to know they were looking into her brother. And so by the time Sandy finished reading this letter, she felt like, well, I have to do something. If the German police, if they can't go to Brazil, maybe I can. Sure enough, later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into her hotel. She knew from John's letters from 10 years ago before he disappeared that this was the general area he had been. And so her plan was, sort of roughly speaking, to search the city, turn it upside down and see what she could learn. Now, obviously, this was a big undertaking. Manaus is a big place. But Sandy, at this point, was all in on this mission. Sandy didn't really know why. For 10 years, basically, she had no idea what happened to John, but it was like now she felt like she was being called to do whatever she had to do to go find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her savings account, bought a flight here, and brought along a tape recorder, like an audio tape recorder, so that she would basically, not miss anything, talk to everybody and learn whatever she could and track it. And her plan basically was to just spend all her time interviewing locals, recording what they say, to try to figure out if anybody knew about John or Akakor. But almost as soon as she actually began doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized how hard it was going to be. It had been almost a decade since her brother had gone missing. So when she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and really couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless rumors with no actual evidence. And on top of that, all the rumors she heard sort of contradicted each other. Some said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then another person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said, nope, none of that's true. What really happened is John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Akakor, but another tribe, and he had decided to just live with them. Now, even though all this information she was getting was sort of all over the place, there still was one common reaction that almost everybody Sandy spoke to had: fear. Each time Sandy asked about Akakor, people would sort of clam up, like they were scared of it. Now, they all clearly knew about it, and most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to sort of leave it alone, like don't talk about that. And that in some ways, looking for Akakor could get her in trouble or even killed. So as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious. And each night, as she laid in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, that this was impossible. But then it was like every night after she'd drift off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her. And he would say to her in these dreams that Akakor was not what he thought it would be. So just about every morning when she woke up, she'd have this sort of refound sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother. But it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, based basically on finances, like she was running out of money and would have to go home soon, during that time period, she heard another rumor. And that was that John had gone into the jungle to find Akakor, but he hadn't gone in there blind. A local chief named Tatunka had told John how to get there. Now, by this point, Sandy had spent 3 weeks in Manaus and its surrounding areas and really felt completely overwhelmed. She really hadn't made much progress anywhere. There was definitely a sense of fear around Akakor, and she was even starting to feel that like looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatunka, whether they were real or not, it actually made her scared. She would love to learn what he knew, to go find Tatunka and see if he knew where her brother was. But there was also a part of her that just feared even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden, Brazil just felt too overwhelming for her. And so after learning about Tatunka, Sandy's reaction was actually to pack up and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy did not just, fly to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for her brother sort of in a roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and she met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter she got. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information. So by the end of all that, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it had not worked. Now, Sandy considered just going home. She was broke, she was scared, and really she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search for her brother. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatunka, because basically it just felt too scary. She'd abandoned it and left for Switzerland and Germany. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatunka was the key, And she had been cowardly. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil. On June 21st, 1990, so about a year after she had made her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatunka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer and also a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but also she did want to draw attention and resources to eventually help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time that she had been back in America earning cash, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos, so she knew by now that Karl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Akakor, the book that, John had been so interested in that led him on this quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos, since tourists came to talk to Tatunka and to try to find it. He was in Barcelos. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village of Barcelos. It was dirty and the houses were all very rundown shacks. She'd read that only about 3,000 people lived there, and between all of them, they only had one phone. And so as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. So Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatunka lived. And the woman immediately nodded, which Sandy expected, because Sandy had not just read up on Barcelos. She now knew a lot about Tatunka as well. And she knew that basically everybody in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who'd once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero too. One time he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. So the country's secret service was actually in Tatunka's debt. And also, of course, Tatunka was interviewed extensively in The Chronicle of Akakor, that book, and was the only known person who'd actually been to the city and knew its location. But more recently, Tatunka had settled into a quieter life and was running a hotel and giving boat tours to visitors along the Rio Negro. And so Sandy got directions to Tatunka's hotel from this woman, and as Sandy and her team began heading deeper into the village to go meet this guy, Sandy felt a mix of excitement and also fear. There was just something sort of heavy about finally meeting this guy. Eventually, the group came to what appeared to be a very isolated-looking hotel surrounded by a wooden gate. And inside of the gated area, up on the veranda of this hotel, was this very lean, shirtless man with a turtle tattooed on his chest. And Sandy knew immediately from the tattoo that that was Tatunka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked towards Tatunka, she pulled out a photo of her brother and held it up, along with an explanation of why she was there. And Tatunka at first just kind of listened and watched as they approached him, but then as he began to hear what she was saying, he smiled, and in broken English, he told Sandy he was surprised she hadn't come sooner. But Sandy didn't return his smile, because as she stared at Tatunka, all she could think of was how wrong everything was. Tatunka's face, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It would turn out those dreams Sandy was having where her brother John would appear to her and tell her that, Akakor was not like he thought it would be, it would turn out that was correct. Akakor didn't exist. However, it was not just a fake city created by that author, Karl Brugger, to sell his book. No, it was something much, much weirder than that. That whole book was based almost exclusively on the stories of Tatunka, the legendary Amazonian chief who Sandy was now meeting, in front of this weird hotel. But Tatunka, the man standing in front of Sandy, was not chief of anything. In fact, he wasn't even Amazonian. In reality, this man parading around as Tatunka was just some random German man named Gunther Hawk who had fled Germany for the Amazon to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife in the 1960s. But when he arrived in the Amazon, he wanted to blend in, but he didn't speak the language, and he had this heavy German accent. So what do? Well, he created a whole made-up story about a long-lost civilization that he supposedly descended from, Akakor. The Akakor story was designed by this guy just to keep him from having to pay child support. The problem was the Akakor story, the legend he created, worked too well. Gunther managed to convince local and even national authorities that he was an actual indigenous person. And then, fatefully, he also convinced this writer, Karl Brugger, that he really was from this lost civilization, and sort of inadvertently created an entire tourism industry based on Akakor. And so when Karl's book came out, Gunther found himself in a bind. To keep his tourist revenue stream afloat, he had to keep pretending that Akakor was real and he knew where it was, while also never letting anybody get there. And both Sandy and the German police believe that to protect this secret, Gunther killed any tourists who insisted on actually visiting Akakor, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Gunther Hawk has never been charged with murder and denies ever hurting anyone. John Reed's body was never found. The author, Karl Brugger, was shot to death in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and rumors still circulate about who killed him and why. And as of 2024, Gunther Hawk was confirmed to be alive and still living in Barcelos, and still insisting that Akakor is real. To this day, explorers still travel to Barcelos to try and find it. The second and final story for this episode is called The Parable. On the night of November 14th, 1994, 56-year-old DeWitt Finley drove his pickup truck up a snowy single-lane highway in the Oregon mountains. It was late, but DeWitt was incredibly alert, and it was taking every ounce of his concentration to not crash. It was snowing really, really hard, and the road was incredibly icy. Not to mention, DeWitt was towing a camper van behind his truck, and the van was sort of sliding around and causing DeWitt to feel really unbalanced as he drove. And so as he's driving along, white-knuckling here, all he could think about was how having taken this route was such a bad idea. So DeWitt was a traveling salesman, and he sold fancy camper vans, which was why he had one on the back of his truck, to drive it around from city to city and to show it off to potential new customers. He'd just been in the Oregon coastal town of Coos Bay and was now driving to Grants Pass, which was in the southern part of the state. Now, the drive should have only taken about 2.5 hours, but DeWitt had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through the mountainous national forest. Except that now, instead of experiencing a tranquil, peaceful drive with lush, stunning Oregon scenery, he was stuck in a snowstorm and fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested slope with a cliff on one side. Now, for just about anybody, this would be a harrowing experience. But for DeWitt, he was especially out of his element. He was from sunny Los Angeles, California. He never drove in conditions like this. And he had only very recently moved to Montana this past summer with his fiancée and 2 kids. And while Montana did have some harsh winters, he hadn't experienced them yet. So this was really a novel experience. But DeWitt was a very religious man. And so as this drive was spiking his heart rate and making him so stressed out, he's white-knuckling his way up this pass, all he began to do was just quietly, internally pray. And for a time, this all seemed to work. Maybe the prayer was working. He was staying on the road. He was making his way. He thought, I'm going to get through this. But eventually, the truck began to slide on the slippery conditions, and DeWitt sort of panicked and hit the brakes as hard as he could, which caused the vehicle to slide even more. And then the next few seconds were just a blur of snow and darkness and trees. And then after what felt like an eternity, where he's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to go off the cliff, his truck slammed into a snowbank, keeping him from falling off the cliff. After that, everything went quiet and still. And for a moment, DeWitt just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering in his chest and his whole body was vibrating with adrenaline. But after a few minutes, DeWitt calmed down enough that he was able to kind of assess the situation. Number one, he didn't go off the cliff. So that was a huge win. He survived. And then he checked himself out, and amazingly, he didn't appear to have any injuries. And also, from the inside, it seemed like his truck was okay too. Maybe he dinged up the outside, from hitting the snowbank, but it just seems like he slid off the road and he was basically okay. To DeWitt, this felt like a miracle. He immediately felt like all that praying he had done had worked. God was looking out for him and saved him. However, when DeWitt put his truck in reverse and attempted to drive out of the snowbank, his tires just spun. They couldn't get traction. And so he realized, yeah, I survived the crash, but I may not be able to move. And I am up in the middle of the wilderness of the Oregon mountains. It's snowing like crazy. Like, what do I do? Also, it's the middle of the night. He doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a radio, so he has no way to call anyone for help. He also wasn't expecting to be stuck, by the side of the road, so he didn't have food or water or really any provisions. And he also hadn't seen another vehicle for a really long time. So he had no idea how frequently people use this road, especially in the winter. And also, he wasn't even supposed to be on this route. So if anybody went looking for him, they wouldn't look here. However, just as, panic began to overwhelm him, DeWitt took a deep breath, said another prayer. God had already saved him once, and DeWitt just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt was able to calm down enough, maybe it was his faith, that he was able to sleep. However, when he woke up, it was clear, one, it's still snowing outside, but worse, it had been snowing clearly all night because his truck was now way more buried in snow. The snow literally made it all the way up to the edge of his window. It's like multiple feet of snow out there. And so DeWitt, he turned his car back on and he threw it in reverse again, seeing if maybe now he'd be able to back out, pretty unlikely, but as soon as he hit the accelerator, the tires clearly spun, he didn't move. Now, it was daylight, and so he's thinking, okay, maybe now I can look around and see a house, a building, or some sign of life somewhere in the distance, just to give me a sense of how close I am to other people. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every direction were trees and snow. He actually couldn't even see the road anymore and had no idea where it was since he'd gotten all turned around during the crash. And so he's just like in this whiteout, basically. And so DeWitt, at this point, was trying his best not to panic. And so instead, he focused on, what do I have? What supplies do I have right now? And he sort of began looking around the inside of his truck. And he found he actually had a lot of useful stuff in here. There were some cushions and a sheet, so he could make a bed for himself to curl up in. And he could also use the truck's heater to keep himself warm and to melt snow for drinking water. He'd obviously just have to be, careful not to burn too much fuel. Also, DeWitt had the camper that was attached to the back of his truck, which you would think would be great for a situation like this. You can just live in the camper until you get rescued. Except DeWitt knew this was not really a real camper. It was a demo model. It was unfurnished, there was no heat, no supplies, nothing. It was really just a shell, so not that useful. But once DeWitt was done doing this mental inventory, even though in some ways he had basically realized, I have very little, he actually felt a sense of calm come over him. He felt like, what? I have enough to keep me alive for a while, and in that time, I'm going to be found. And so he would just leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally let up. But even with the now clear weather, the snow didn't melt. And then soon after that, another storm came and dumped more snow and ice all over his truck. Also, during this time frame, DeWitt didn't see any other cars or trucks or plows. So he had a feeling that the road he had crashed on was now so clogged with snow, it wasn't even usable. But even though at this point DeWitt was extremely hungry, he had no food, it's been several days here, he also was warm and dry inside of his truck. And critically, he was also hydrated. He'd been drinking plenty of melted snow, so he was, surviving as best as he could. And then also, to ward off all the negative, intrusive thoughts about what could happen to him out here, DeWitt had begun to pass the time by meticulously crossing off the days in his yearly planning calendar and also writing letters. DeWitt always carried around pen, paper, and envelopes inside of his work bag, which he obviously had with him. So he had begun writing to the people he loved, his fiancée, his sons, and even to his boss to explain what had happened and why he had missed work. And in each letter, DeWitt did not sound scared or sad. In fact, if anything, he seemed rejuvenated. He seemed happy. He would reflect on how much love and joy was in his life and how lucky he was to have that. And he would tell the people he was writing letters to, like his fiancée and sons, that he really wasn't worried. He knew he was going to be okay because God was clearly looking out for him. The days turned into weeks, But DeWitt continued to stay warm and basically comfortable and alive, even without any food. But DeWitt believed that his hunger actually was a sign that God was looking out for him. DeWitt had no idea how long somebody could live literally without eating. But after 2 months, DeWitt had tracked the days in his calendar. 2 months had gone by. DeWitt felt like, I should be dead. I haven't eaten in 2 months. But he wasn't dead. And he felt like that was a sign. God was keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. It has to be. On the morning of May 20th, 1995, a teenager, along with his girlfriend, drove up the same mountain road that DeWitt had been on when he got into his accident. And even though it was May, there was quite a bit of snow still, and the road was still quite icy. And about halfway up a particularly steep incline, this teenage kid lost control of his truck. It began to skid, and he went off the road and crashed into a snowbank. Luckily, the teenager and his girlfriend were okay. And for a minute, they just sat there kind of dazed. And then the driver put the car in reverse and tried to move, but the car wouldn't move. The tires just spun. So eventually, the teenager climbed out of the car to examine his vehicle to see if there was serious damage here or if he was just stuck in the snow. But when he did this, when he climbed out of his vehicle, he looked just up the road a ways, and off the side of the road, basically equal to where he was relative to the road, was another vehicle. It was a pickup truck with a camper attached to it that was clearly half buried in the melting snow. And so the teenager told his girlfriend that he was going to go take a look in case, somebody else had a wreck and they needed help. So this kid, he leaves his girlfriend and he hikes over to the truck. And when he gets there, he can't see inside of it. It's covered with too much snow. But he brushes off some of the snow, revealing one of the windows into the truck. And he looked in, and for a second, he couldn't quite see what was in there. But then eventually he saw it. And when he did, he just gasped and backed up. After DeWitt crashed, he was certain he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated part of this mountain. I mean, he clearly knew that, but he really believed that God was going to save him. He felt like it was God who kept him from going off the cliff, and now God was going to intervene and save him, that somebody was going to show up and rescue him, effectively because of God. So because of that belief, because of how strongly he believed that, DeWitt did not get out of his truck. I mean, he got out maybe to use the bathroom, but for the most part, he stayed in his truck. And unfortunately, had he just gotten out and really looked around, he would have seen there was actually a paved path that, due to the way the winds whip on that side of the mountain, the snow doesn't stick to the ground. And so even with a huge snowstorm, he would have seen a black paved path going down the mountainside, and he could have walked it down to civilization, and it would have saved him. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited here, somebody would save him because God was going to save him again. He just didn't leave his truck. And then when he began to feel that incredible ache from the starvation, the fact that he wasn't dying, months in with no food, it sort of built that resolve inside of him that clearly God has a plan. Clearly. I should be dead right now, and I am not. I need to maintain faith, and I'm going to be saved. And in many ways, that's beautiful. It's poetic in some ways. But it ultimately led to his death. That teenage driver who happened to get into a car accident up on that mountain road, who then saw the truck and the camper, well, that was obviously DeWitt's truck and camper. And when the teenager walked over and cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, who was deceased inside of the truck. DeWitt ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which is the final day that he crossed off on his calendar. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Kroll, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In December of 2005, a young woman walked down a sidewalk in New York City. There were Christmas decorations on all the buildings and Christmas lights. It was very festive. But as she walked along, she glanced over at a newspaper stand, and she saw something on the front page of that paper that literally made her stop in her tracks, and not because it was festive. It was awful. Right there on the front page was a picture of the one thing in her life that she'd hoped she would never, ever see again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, on the next extremely hot day, sneak into the Follow Button's house and jack their thermostat all the way up to the highest possible setting, then go ahead and just rip the thermostat out of the wall and then leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods leaned towards the mirror to put on her eyeliner inside the bathroom of her small apartment in New York City. Catherine's phone was sitting on the bathroom counter, and she heard it buzz, but she didn't even look to see who was calling. She didn't have time to talk to anyone, because she had to finish getting ready for her 7 o'clock shift at work. So Catherine had moved to New York City from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer on Broadway. But everything here was so expensive that in addition to chasing her dream, she also had to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. Now, 2 of those jobs were pretty standard. She worked as a waitress and also taught children's dance classes. But tonight, she was getting ready to go to her 3rd job, and this job was not really standard at all. In fact, to her, she was sort of embarrassed about it. And because of that, she was keeping it a secret from almost everybody in her life. Her 3rd job was working as a topless dancer at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers. Catherine honestly hated the work, but it paid really well, and if she wanted to have her shot at Broadway, she needed to pay for voice lessons and dance classes. Now, she did live in Manhattan, which was the most expensive part of the already very expensive city, and she knew that she could save some money if she just moved to a neighborhood where rent was cheaper. But when she had first moved to New York, she had lived in a less expensive neighborhood for that reason, and unfortunately, her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The experience had been so traumatic that Catherine had, at the time, considered just leaving New York and going back to Ohio and just being done with this place. But in the end, she had decided to stay in New York and continue chasing her dream. Now, she did move within New York. She'd gotten this apartment in Manhattan because it was a lot safer. And she also got a roommate to help with the cost. His name was David Hahn, he was 23, and he was one of Catherine's friends from back home in Ohio. But at this very moment, David was not inside the apartment. He'd gone outside to get his car so he could drive Catherine to work. Catherine finished her makeup and left the bathroom, and as she walked through the living room, she stepped over a black dog that was sleeping on the floor. The dog was not Catherine's, and it actually was not David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter, so this dog was just staying with them while its owners were out of town. Just like Catherine, David also had a bunch of part-time jobs to help make ends meet. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment. Now, Catherine and David had actually been romantic at one point. They had dated for a little while, but these days they were just roommates, living together to split the bills. Although, secretly, Catherine did sometimes wonder if, maybe they should give it another shot to try being a couple again. Thanksgiving had been a few days ago, and instead of going home to Ohio like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David, and it had been a really nice time. Plus, David knew about Catherine's third job of working at flash dancers, and he didn't judge her for it. And Catherine felt like a lot of people did, so she liked that about him. But the biggest hurdle that Catherine could see to potentially rekindling their relationship was the fact that David disliked basically every man she met, whether she was dating them or not. He just did not like them. Now, some of these guys, she could understand why David, didn't like them. Like there was this guy, Joe, that she had dated briefly, who really she'd only met because he was a patron of her strip club. But then there were people like Paul, who was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym, who she'd only seen off and on, and who was nothing but nice to David. And even though Paul and Catherine were not dating now and mostly just spoke on the phone periodically, David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just did not like the guy. But for now, Catherine figured, you know what, I'm not going to figure out my entire romantic life. I just need to finish getting ready and go downstairs so she wouldn't keep David waiting. So Catherine went into her bedroom and began getting dressed. And that's when she heard that dog start barking at something in the living room. And so, curious, Catherine walked in that direction to see what was going on. A little while later, Catherine's roommate, David, walked quickly along the sidewalk to get his car, which was parked a ways up the street. He was out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he had to hurry, so he jumped in and he drove back to the apartment building and he called Catherine as he pulled up out front. When she didn't answer, he threw on his hazards and he climbed back out to go into the building to go get her. And he had just made it up the flight of stairs that led to his second floor apartment, and he was going down the hallway when he saw something that made him come to an abrupt stop. It was that black dog that he was dog sitting. Somehow it had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway outside of his apartment door. David blinked and then realized that his neighbor, a man he rarely interacted with named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. And Brad was holding a leash that was clearly clipped onto the dog's collar. For a second, Brad looked surprised, and David was just completely confused about why this guy had the dog that he was dog sitting on a leash. But then Brad told David that he had found the dog wandering around, recognized it as David's, and brought it back to his apartment. Brad said he had just knocked on David's apartment door, but so far nobody had answered. So at this point, David understood, why Brad has the dog, but he didn't know why the dog was out of the apartment in the first place. But he kept that to himself and just thanked Brad, took the leash, and then stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The apartment door was shut, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had left it unlocked or not, so he just opened it, and he called out Catherine's name. But there was no answer, which was weird, so he stepped inside. Now, he didn't see Catherine, but he did see the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open, so he walked over to it, and he called out to her again. And then when she didn't call back, he tried pushing her door open. But the door didn't really open. It instead swung maybe a few inches and then stopped. And David felt resistance on the other side, like something maybe on the ground was holding the door from opening all the way. And so now, with all these strange things happening, David's starting to feel pretty worried. And so the surge of adrenaline came over him, and he just shoved the door open, and he stuck his head in, and he looked inside. And when he saw what was in there, he immediately pulled back, turned around, ran into the hallway, and he called the police. A half an hour later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up a flight of stairs at an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city was known to be extremely safe. Homicides never really happened here. But if the 911 caller had been telling the truth, Getz knew that a potential grisly murder scene was in fact waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he reached the second floor landing, he saw there were already a few other NYPD officers on the scene, and one of them was speaking to this young, skinny guy standing in the hallway who looked really upset, and he was holding a leash that was connected to a black dog. Another officer walked over to Getz and filled him in. He said the man that was being spoken to was the victim's roommate, David Hahn, and he was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and then walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the apartment door. His plan was to look at the scene himself before he began questioning anyone. Getz put on some disposable rubber gloves and checked out the door frame to the actual apartment, and then he also looked at the door itself. But he didn't see any damage that could signify forced entry. So he stepped into the apartment, and he saw that the small living room was a little bit messy. But it wasn't like it had been ransacked or something. The futon was pulled out and there were some men's clothes strewn around, but it sort of looked like a typical place that people lived. And so Getz walked through the living room, being careful not to disturb anything, and he went towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was. The door was open just wide enough that Getz was able to get through, and when he stepped through and was inside the room, he saw blood everywhere. It was all over the walls and the furniture, and the room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. One of the dresser drawers was open, and lots of women's clothing was scattered all over the place, and the mattress had been completely taken off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor, and that's actually what was blocking the door from opening all the way. And then, in the middle of the room, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and the t-shirt had a very obvious shoe print on it, like whoever had killed Catherine had stepped on her. And there were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands and arms, which Getz knew meant she must have fought back against her attacker. But the worst injuries she sustained were definitely to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat so deeply that they had almost decapitated her. And so to Getz, right away, it seemed like whoever killed Catherine had been in an absolute rage. At that point, Getz heard footsteps coming from behind him, and he stood up and he turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. Now, the blocked door was making maneuvering in and out of this bedroom pretty difficult, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to pick up the mattress and carefully lean it against the wall, so the bedroom door could now swing open all the way. Then Detective Getz just stepped back and let the forensics team get to work. He watched as they pulled that shoe print off the t-shirt Catherine was wearing, and then also there was a second identical shoe print that was on her bed sheets that they also grabbed. To Getz, both of these prints did appear to be from the exact same shoe, and to the naked eye, these prints appeared, at least to Getz, to belong to very likely an average-sized man. Detective Getz was immediately curious about something, so he stepped out of the bedroom into the living room, and he quickly found a couple pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor. And although the tread of these shoes did not match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, they did appear to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m. on November 27, 2005, Detective Getz sat down at a table inside of an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. And once he did, he handed a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim, and Detective Getz' current number one suspect. There had been no sign of forced entry at the apartment that David and Catherine shared, which meant that Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by somebody who did. And the murder had been committed with a knife in a really savage way that struck Getz as being a personally motivated attack. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been trashed, nothing seemed to have been stolen, and because Catherine had been found partially undressed, there was potentially a sexual motive at play as well. So Getz's working theory here was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well and had easy access to her living space. And David fit that profile to a T. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and brought out his notepad, he did a quick scan of David's forearms and his hands, and he saw that David had no visible cuts, scrapes, or bruises. The detective thought that Catherine's killer likely would have some injuries there because she had obviously been fighting for her life. She would have left a mark on them. But Getz didn't say anything about this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward and he asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a bit, but he took a deep breath to calm himself, and he said that he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40 p.m. That was when he had left to go get his car so he could come back and drive Catherine to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But he said retrieving his car had taken longer than he expected, because on the way, he had run into some of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them. He said after he had done that and he had gotten his car and he went back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting outside by the curb. But when he got there was no sign of her, and she didn't answer when he called her. So David said he'd ultimately gone inside and ran upstairs to the apartment, and in the hallway he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was oddly holding the leash of the black dog that David was supposed to be looking after. And then David said he went into his apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. David said he had called 911 right away. It was right around 7 p.m. And at this, Getz stopped writing on the notepad and just looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he'd only been out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and that in that narrow window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered and the killer had also escaped. It honestly sounded like one of the worst alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't want David to know just how close he was to getting arrested for murder, because he didn't want David to get scared and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very sympathetic as he asked how long David had known Catherine for. David said they had met back in Ohio a few years ago while Catherine was visiting her hometown. They'd begun dating, and he had ultimately moved out to New York to live with her. But it wasn't long before Catherine broke up with him and then asked him to move out. But David said he had not been able to afford his own place, so he had started sleeping in his car. And Catherine had felt bad about that, so she had ultimately let him move back in on the condition that he slept on the futon out in the living room. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page, because David was not just Catherine's roommate, he was her ex-boyfriend. An ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see Catherine alive and discovered her body. Getz was more confident than ever that he was sitting across from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but right now, he needed to go check on something. David agreed to wait, and Getz stood up to leave. But he stopped at the door, and he asked David for one last thing before he left. He asked what his shoe size was. And without missing a beat, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down, and then he left. What he hadn't told David was the reason he was stepping out of the room was to go get some information from the NYPD's forensics team and the uniformed officers who were currently questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, so about 3 p.m. the next day, Getz was sitting at his desk feeling completely exhausted, but was pounding yet another cup of coffee. He'd been up all night interrogating David, who was still literally sitting right down the hall in the interrogation room. And also, Getz had been going back and forth with the forensics team and other officers and detectives who were out in the neighborhood, and he still had loads more to do before he could finally go to sleep. Right now, Getz was going over a new batch of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking the neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. And just like Getz had hoped, the information they were getting did contradict pieces of David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 p.m. and said that at that time, Catherine was fine. But two neighbors said they heard screams coming from the apartment before 6:40 p.m. The man in the unit directly above David and Catherine said he had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. And the people in the unit next door to David and Catherine said they'd heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture moving around even earlier, between 5:45 and 6 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had done anything about these noises because the noises had stopped pretty quickly. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had said he had found the black dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had said that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 p.m., a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew witnesses were often bad with time, and in a dense New York City apartment building, there were lots of noises coming from lots of units, but still, it looked to him like David's alibi had serious problems. And so the detective sat back and had some more coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the forensics team with an update about those shoe prints that were on Catherine's shirt and the bedsheets. And the prints were indeed left behind by a roughly average-sized man. They were a men's size 10.5. And this was the exact size Getz knew David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room to have yet another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer David a water. He just sat down and he confronted him with all these new facts. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his shoe size, that his neighbors had heard screams before David had supposedly left the building, and that Brad said he'd seen David in the hallway at least a half an hour earlier than David had claimed he was there. Getz leaned in and told David that there were also security cameras in the apartment building, and his officers were already in the process of getting access to that footage. So if David had anything to say, he better say it now. Getz watched as David's expression went from exhausted to clearly afraid. It seemed like this might be the first time that David realized the police truly did not believe his story. And after a second of just stunned silence, David insisted that he had not killed Catherine, and he begged Getz to believe him. But when Getz just glared back at him completely unmoved, David launched into a whole news story, one he had not mentioned at all over the last 20 hours of interrogation. David said Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. She had dated him, but David had always thought he was kind of a creep. And David said Catherine had told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So David said the police really ought to go investigate Paul, not him. To Getz, this seemed like a desperate last-minute attempt to cast suspicion on somebody else. But he knew he did have to follow every lead, so he did write down Paul's name and told David they'd look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room, and reporters from all the daily papers were beginning to assemble right outside. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder and pictures of her smiling face were all over the news. The front page of the New York Daily News carried a headline that made Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." Inside, the article reported that Catherine's family hadn't known she was working as a topless dancer until they literally flew to the city from Ohio to collect her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers seemed intent on running with it. And a media circus was like the last thing Getz wanted. His team was already under enough pressure to make an arrest as it was. And it was going to be even harder to do their jobs now that a bunch of tips were going to be flooding in from the public from all this media. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He'd finished the day yesterday feeling pretty confident that David was his murderer. So when he'd sent David home, he had given him instructions not to leave the city, because he intended to arrest David and soon. But first, Getz did need to follow up on the other leads he had, to hopefully rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man that David had named, who officers had tracked down and brought in, the man who supposedly was obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look at Paul's shoes, and he could see that they were a pretty typical size too. At a glance, they looked like they could also be a 10.5. Getz also looked for scratches or bruises on Paul's skin, in particular on his forearms and his hands. And he did see one. There was a small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked about it, and Paul said his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken, and he said he'd heard all about Catherine's death in the papers, and he just wanted to help if he could. When Getz told him that they'd gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes and said, David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they'd been dating off and on ever since. At the time of Catherine's death, he said they had been off, but Paul said he still cared about her and had hoped that maybe one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't actually seen Catherine on the day of her death, but that he had actually spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon, which was not unusual. The two did speak on the phone from time to time. That's all it was. Paul said he actually had tried calling her a second time that day, but she didn't answer. But Paul said he really didn't think much of it. And then Paul said that night he wound up going shopping with some friends and then also to a local bar to watch the Jets game at about 8:30. Getz made a note to follow up on Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have killed Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up, and he said there had been some stalker guy named Joe who'd been one of Catherine's regulars at the strip club. Months ago, he'd somehow gotten Catherine's phone number and had reached out to her outside of the club. And around that same time, Catherine had actually gotten roofied during one of her strip club shifts. A roofie is called the date rape drug. It basically makes you incapacitated and effectively unconscious. You don't remember anything. People will be given a roofie and then be sexually assaulted. That's often its use. And even though he'd never been able to prove this, Paul always suspected it had been Joe who gave Catherine that roofie. Catherine had cut off contact with Joe, but the whole incident had bothered Paul so much that he tried to convince Catherine to just quit the exotic dancing scene, but she refused. Paul admitted that he actually went on to call Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her. And Catherine had been so mad about that she stopped talking to Paul for weeks. And so Getz jotted all this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this guy Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but it was definitely in Catherine's phone. Because the last time Paul ever spoke on the phone with Catherine, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that really surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. And at this, Getz studied Paul's face, looking for any hint of deception. This whole Joe story seemed like it might just be a way to deflect suspicion from Paul himself. But it really didn't feel like Paul was lying here. And besides, Catherine's phone records would be simple enough to verify. Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of Catherine's customers at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling really annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been a call from another reporter, but Getz hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. But for now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he'd subpoenaed yesterday, and they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. Both he and Joe had called Catherine shortly before she died. So he'd brought in Joe for an interview, and he asked him to explain why, after months of silence, he had called Catherine right before she turned up dead. And Joe had replied he'd only called her to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He had claimed that he was really just trying to be friendly. But then Getz just asked Joe point blank if he had ever roofied anyone's drink before. And at this, Joe's eyes went wide and he kind of sputtered out that he would never dream of doing anything like that. But based on Joe's tone, Getz really felt like he was lying. And so now, Getz felt like the entire investigation was wide open. A few days ago, he had been absolutely confident that David was the killer, but men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually looking more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman, and they confirmed that he really had stopped and talked to them on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would prove David was lying about his alibi, at least in terms of when he was there, it actually showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up with David's story because he said he left around 6:40. Now, this did not prove that David was innocent. Based on what the neighbors had heard, she could have been killed before 6:38, but there weren't a lot of cameras in the apartment building, and no angle covered the hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another, whether Brad Stewart, or anybody else for that matter, had gone into the apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter, but this time he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and there was this obvious excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they'd just discovered something big, something they completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics team member explained that when they'd first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was stuck behind the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they'd done that, the mattress had actually covered up something that was right there on the wall all along. A bloody handprint. It was not until a couple of days later, after they'd carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress back down onto the floor, and that's when they found the handprint. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news, because now he knew all he had to do was go get handprints from all of his suspects, which seemed like that would be pretty easy to do. But he quickly realized he had a problem, because some of his suspects had already lawyered up at this point, and they were refusing to speak with police, let alone hand over their prints. And Getz really could not force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so that meant Getz was now in this weird catch-22, because he needed the suspects' prints in order to make the arrest, but he also couldn't get their prints unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation kind of stalled out. Weeks went by, and Detective Getz started to get really frustrated because there was just nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. However, the case was still receiving a ton of coverage in the press, and to a lot of people, it looked like the NYPD was just sort of dropping the ball here. But then on December 16th, so 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much actually ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of one of the newspapers in New York. And what this woman said led Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on forensic evidence and numerous interviews, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of November 27, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer climbed the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she'd be getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. And the fact that she even worked there secretly really bothered the killer way more than they would ever let on. The idea of Catherine dancing and giving her attention to other men made the killer so jealous they couldn't even stand it. Now, the killer had tried to talk with Catherine and win her over, but she had rejected him. So the time for talking was over. And so the killer quietly walked up to the door of apartment 2D and reached down and turned the handle, which was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer brought out the knife that they had hidden inside of their sweatshirt. But then something they had not anticipated happened. There was this dog lying on the apartment floor that got up and began to bark at them. For a moment, the killer thought about just abandoning the plan and leaving, but then Catherine, alerted by the dog, came out of the bedroom and looked right at the killer and saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off limits to the killer. And just thinking about that, the surge of anger suddenly overtook them, and the killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, lifting up the mattress as a sort of barricade, but the killer just forced their way past it, and they grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine, she fought back. She began thrashing around, doing everything she could to break free, but she couldn't. And so they struggled and began smashing into the furniture and knocking things down all over the room. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up that knife they had brought, and they slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with this fatal wound, Catherine kept on fighting. And she was so vicious that the killer actually had to brace themselves against a wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos, the killer didn't realize, as they're fighting off Catherine, that they had placed a bloody hand on the wall, leaving a print behind. Finally, when Catherine fell to the floor, the killer was still blinded with their rage, and they just got down there and began stabbing her over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer just jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that black dog that had barked at them had gotten out. Now, the killer wanted the dog back in the apartment, but the dog was clearly on edge. They were still barking at the killer. And so instead, the killer just shut the apartment door, trapping the dog in the hallway. And then the killer fled the apartment building out the back door, where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past came back to bite them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who didn't know Catherine was walking down the streets of New York when she noticed a newspaper. And on the cover of this newspaper was plastered the face of the killer, who was currently a suspect in a murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this person. They, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had never filed a police report. But after seeing that this horrible person was being actively accused of murder, she called the NYPD and she told them what she knew. And the NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's accusation as the basis to arrest the killer. And finally, once they were under arrest, Getz was able to get their handprint. And those prints did in fact match the bloody handprint found on Catherine's wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions of Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep who had assaulted at least one other woman before he killed Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell towers would prove that Paul was near Catherine's apartment building immediately before her murder, and he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car, and then he hustled upstairs to the apartment, knowing Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for 20 minutes, that was still long enough for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine, and slip away unnoticed. Paul was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, December 23, 2005. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the early hours of Thursday, February 21st, 2008, a 6-year-old girl suddenly woke up to the sound of a creaking noise coming from the hallway, just outside her bedroom door. It was a blustery night in rural Nevada, so she figured, the sound must just be the wind outside. But then she heard another noise that sounded more like footsteps, and this time it was even closer to her bedroom. Terrified, she pulled the covers up tight around her chin and looked straight down towards the crack in the door, out into the hallway. A moment later, she saw the outline of a person standing right outside her room. She squinted, trying to make out a face, wondering if maybe it was one of her parents checking in on her. But as quick as the shadow appeared, it vanished into thin air, and then a moment later, the little girl heard a loud bang. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the Follow Button's hairspray with bear repellent. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of February 7th, 2008, 36-year-old Ben Oxley pulled his truck into the parking lot at the Douglas County Fairgrounds, located near the town of Minden, Nevada, a half an hour east of Lake Tahoe. He killed the engine and then zipped up his jacket, bracing for the windy, cold weather outside. Ben glanced in his rearview mirror, and he saw his 6-year-old daughter, Alyssa, sitting in the back seat. She was bundled up in her winter jacket, and she was grinning ear to ear. Alyssa had been looking forward to this night for weeks. It was the annual pre-Valentine's Day father-daughter dance, where dads brought their daughters to the local fairgrounds for a night of dancing and candy. Ever since Ben and his wife Melissa took Alyssa out shopping for a fancy new dress for this occasion, the dance had become all she could talk about. And Ben had been excited too. He jumped at basically any chance to make special memories with his daughter, especially given the trauma that she had endured over the past few years. He felt a pang of guilt just thinking about it. Ben's relationship with Alyssa's mother, Dawn, had always been rocky. They were divorced, but during their marriage and after, they had fought constantly. They had also both cheated on each other. Ben was short-tempered and angry while they were together, and even though they had broken up when Alyssa was just a toddler, he feared that relationship and its fallout had done lasting damage. They had shared custody of Alyssa for a while, but Dawn was a drinker, and Ben suspected she was also using other drugs. She also brought sketchy people home with her, and she was always broke with 100 excuses about why she couldn't hold a job. Ben felt like Dawn always blamed everybody else for all her problems, which was yet another thing that just drove him crazy. So a few years ago, he decided to just file for sole custody of Alyssa. It had been a very ugly court battle, but the judge ultimately ruled in his favor. And so Ben, after taking custody of Alyssa, had worked hard to make her life as stable as possible, even though he knew, every other weekend his daughter would go and see Dawn, and he really had no control over how that interaction went. But for now, Ben just pushed the thought of his ex-wife out of his head, and he stepped out of his truck. Then he opened up the passenger door and held his hand out for Alyssa, helping her climb out of the truck without getting dust on her brand new beautiful dress. The father and daughter followed the sound of the loud music across the parking lot and into the fairgrounds event building. Once inside, they found a very crowded party. Alyssa immediately saw a few friends waving at her from the dance floor, and so Ben helped her out of her winter coat and then watched as she went running across the room to say hello. Ben smiled to himself. He knew the drill with these father-daughter dances. Alyssa would run around with her friends for a few hours before eventually, right at the end, finding him for just the final dance of the night. That was it. But even though he really didn't see his daughter much during this dance, for him, as long as Alyssa was happy, he was happy. And in fact, Alyssa really did seem to be doing quite well these days. I mean, during the custody battle, she was very unhappy. And then initially, when Ben had begun dating his current wife, Melissa, Alyssa was, she was 2 years old, but she just didn't really like Melissa. But eventually she had adjusted to her and seemed to really like her. And, when he and Melissa got married a little over a year ago, nobody was happier about it than Alyssa, which had been a huge relief. And so now he's looking out, seeing his daughter, and it just seemed like she was super well adjusted and living her best life. And so Ben made his way over to the snack table and poured himself a glass of punch. Then he wandered over to a table full of other dads, and he sat down in one of the folding chairs and started chatting. A few hours later, the DJ came over the speaker and announced that it was going to be the last song of the night. And sure enough, Alyssa came running around the corner to find her dad. Ben took his daughter out onto the dance floor and twirled her around as the first notes of a song called Butterfly Kisses came on, which just so happened to be their special song. Ben tried his best to soak in every second of the dance. It had been a long road to get to a night like this. A couple weeks later, on the evening of Wednesday, February 20th, Ben cleared dinner plates from the dining room table while his daughter Alyssa, his wife Melissa, and Melissa's teenage brother Craig sat down in the living room to watch a movie. Craig had come to live with them a few weeks ago. His mother's new boyfriend had moved into his house, and Craig didn't like the boyfriend very much, so here he was. And for the most part, Craig fit right in, so his presence in the house really was not a big deal. Grocery bills had gotten more expensive, and the house was definitely more crowded, but these were minor inconveniences, and Ben was happy to give Craig a comfortable place to live. Ben set the dinner dishes in the sink, grabbed a bag of candy, and made his way into the living room where he sat down beside his wife. She had the movie queued up, and she rested her head on his shoulder and then hit play. And within minutes, Ben heard a quiet snore and knew that Melissa had fallen asleep. Ben passed the candy bag over to Craig and Alyssa for them to share, and then the family settled in for the movie. By the time it was over, only Ben and his daughter were the ones left awake. Ben sent Alyssa off to brush her teeth, then slowly he got up from the couch, trying hard not to wake up his wife. He guided her head down onto a pillow and then grabbed a blanket and put it over her. Craig was asleep on the other end of the couch, so Ben threw a blanket on him too. Then he turned off the TV and quietly made his way to the back of the house to tuck his daughter into bed. A few hours later, Ben's wife Melissa woke up in a panic, feeling totally disoriented and convinced she was late for work. It took her a minute to even realize she was on the couch in her living room, and then she looked up at the clock above the mantel and saw it was only 2:30 in the morning. And so she realized she must have fallen asleep during the movie again. She looked down at the other end of the couch and saw there was just a crumpled blanket where Craig must have been sitting. He must have fallen asleep too, but at some point before her, woke up and went to his own bed. Melissa rolled off the couch and then headed to the back bedroom where she crawled into bed next to Ben, who was already fast asleep. And it felt like she had only just dozed off when suddenly there was this ear-splitting loud bang that ripped her from her sleep. Her ears were ringing and she was totally disoriented. She had no idea what it was. And so confused, she rolled over and tried to shake Ben awake, but he was fast asleep. And so she just pulled herself out of bed and went to go investigate the noise herself. As she walked out into the hall, she looked over at the nightstand and saw the clock said 3:30 a.m. So she'd only been asleep for maybe an hour. Once she was out in the hallway, she began walking around looking for Craig or Alyssa, but the house seemed empty. But at the end of the hallway, she felt this rush of cold wind, and she looked up and saw the front door was wide open, letting all the winter air blow in. And at that point, Melissa froze. Someone clearly had been inside their home. Terrified, she turned around and ran back to the back bedroom. She flipped on the light and was about to tell Ben to wake up, somebody's broken in, when she stopped. Because now, with the lights on, she could see the bed sheets were soaked with blood. Melissa called 911, and within minutes, 2 officers from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department pulled up in front of their home, which was a ranch out in rural Nevada. The officers stepped out of the cruiser with their guns drawn. They knew they were about to walk into an active crime scene, and there was a chance the perpetrator could still be on the premises. One officer pointed his flashlight and gun towards the house, illuminating the front door, which was wide open. He looked over at his partner. Dispatch had told them backup was on the way, but there was also an injured man inside this house. They couldn't wait for more officers to get here. They had to act now. So they moved towards the house. Once inside, they entered the living room, and it was dark, and there was no one in there. They turned into the hallway and made their way down until they stopped outside of a closed door on their immediate right. One of the officers let it swing open. They looked inside and shined their flashlights, and they could see it was a bedroom. In the beam of one of their flashlights, they could see that there was somebody hiding beneath a pile of covers on the bed. The officers shouted out, "Police!" and ordered the person to come out with their hands up, but the bundle of covers didn't move. The officers then heard ragged breathing coming from beneath the blankets. Slowly, they approached the bed and yanked off the covers, and a teenage boy whipped his hands into the air, visibly shaking as he screamed out that his name was Craig Nichols and he lived here. One of the officers told Craig to stay put. Then he told his partner to stay with Craig as he continued to go search the rest of the house. Back out in the hallway, that officer was about to continue his scan of the property when he turned and he nearly fell over when he saw this woman come barging out of a back bedroom, soaked in blood, and she was holding hands with this little girl who was sobbing to herself. The woman looked completely panicked, and she turned and saw the officer, and she could barely speak, but she just said, "My husband's in there," pointing to the bedroom, and she said he's badly injured. The officer nodded and realized this must be the woman who called 911, and so he rushed past her and the little girl and made his way into the back bedroom. But the second he looked down onto that bed, he knew this woman's husband was not just badly injured. This man was dead. 15 minutes later, Sergeant Ron Elges of the Douglas County Sheriff's Department stepped through the door of the small ranch home, which was now lit up outside with blue and red police lights, and inside with every light switch in the house flipped on. Crime scene techs were beginning to file in, and uniformed officers outside were keeping all the neighbors back. One of the first responding officers came to meet Sergeant Elges in the kitchen. He told him that a man named Ben Oxley was the deceased man in the back bedroom. He'd been shot in the head while he was asleep next to his wife Melissa, who had called 911. When the responding officer and his partner arrived, he said the front door of the house was wide open, and the only people inside the house were Melissa, her 16-year-old brother Craig, and her 6-year-old stepdaughter. And none of them said they saw or heard anything except for the 6-year-old. She said that she had heard floorboards creaking and had seen a shadow. The officer also said there was no sign of forced entry and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Elges nodded and thanked the officer for the info. Then he strode down the hallway to the back bedroom. Ben's body was still in the bed. Elges stepped closer to get a better look at the blood spatter on the sheets, and he noticed little pellets scattered all across the bed, which he immediately recognized as the remnants of a shotgun blast. But beyond the bed being just a grisly mess, nothing else in the bedroom was out of place. The killer had clearly snuck into the bedroom, taken their shot, and fled. Elges left the bedroom and went over to where Melissa was sitting on the couch in the living room, draped in a blanket and crying. The little girl was sitting next to her, looking terrified and confused. Elges wanted to speak to Melissa, but before he did, just by looking at her, he noticed something strange. Melissa had said she had been asleep next to Ben when he was killed, but she had no injuries, despite the fact that shotgun pellets had clearly sprayed across the bed. I mean, a shotgun is more of an area weapon. It fires in more than one direction. And interestingly, there really wasn't any blood spatter on her, not on her face, not on her clothes. She's laying next to her husband when he's shot with a shotgun. You would think blood would spatter all over her. And she did have blood on her, quite a bit, on her hands and arms, but it looked like it got there from her touching her husband after the fact. Just then, an investigator tapped Elges on the shoulder and let him know that they had found shotgun shells on a dresser in Craig's bedroom, as well as 2 actual shotguns in the garage, and that Craig, the 16-year-old, had said they were his. Elges glanced down at Melissa again, and then over towards Craig, who was sitting on his bed talking to an investigator. Then he looked at Alyssa, and he saw she was crying. As far as he was concerned, this little girl was the only certain victim here this evening. Melissa and Craig, on the other hand, he wasn't so sure. To him, this was clearly a murder committed by someone who knew Ben. After all, there was no attempt to rob the place, no sign of forced entry either, which meant whoever shot Ben either had access to the house or was already inside. Before leaving, Elges asked some of the officers to canvass the neighborhood to see if anybody had seen or heard anything suspicious. And then he told Craig and Melissa to get themselves organized because when they were ready, he wanted to see them down at the station for questioning. An hour later, Elges walked into an interview room at the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. Melissa was already sitting at a table waiting for him. Her face was red and puffy, and she was disheveled. She looked very distraught, and the moment she laid eyes on Elges, she just started bawling. Elges sat down in a chair next to her and pressed record on the tape player between them on the table. Then he told Melissa that he understood how difficult his request was going to be, but he needed her to walk him through what happened that night, step by step. And he needed to get her whole story on tape because he needed to clear her as a suspect. Melissa gasped and grabbed a tissue from the box on the interview table. It seemed like the idea of her being a suspect had sent her into a new wave of sadness, and it took her a few minutes before she was calm enough to even speak. When she finally began rehashing all the details of the night, her voice was very shaky, and Elges couldn't help but feel like her grief seemed very sincere. But it was also hard to ignore the fact that if she was lying next to her husband when he was shot, she really should have had blood spatter all over her. And she should have been hurt by at least 1 or 2 of the shotgun pellets. And yet she had walked away with virtually no blood spatter and unhurt. And so Elges actually brought this up to Melissa. He said, "I think it's odd that these things are not here." And he watched for any signs of defensiveness in her response. But Melissa just shrugged and agreed that, yeah, it was strange. She must have just gotten very lucky or something. Elges nodded, but he was not necessarily convinced. And so he changed tactics, and he asked Melissa whether she knew if Ben had any enemies who might want to hurt him. Melissa sighed and explained that Alyssa's mother, Dawn, was a total nightmare, and she had some awful friends that Ben had fought with her about. Melissa said she and Ben barely let Alyssa spend any time at Dawn's house because Dawn's general lifestyle felt literally too dangerous for a small girl to be around. That information piqued Elges' interest, and so he knew one of his very next steps was going to be tracking down and speaking with Dawn. If Melissa was painting an accurate picture of her, Dawn could be a viable suspect. At that point, Elges stopped the tape recorder and told Melissa to hang tight. He might have other questions as the morning unfolded. Melissa nodded and took another tissue. Back in the hallway, an officer waved Elges down and handed him a report. Forensics had done a preliminary analysis of the shotgun pellets that they had collected from the scene, and they were a match for number 8 birdshot shells, which was the exact kind of shells that had been found in Craig's room. Elges raised his eyebrows. Then he thanked the officer and walked straight into the interview room next to Melissa's. This is where Craig was waiting. And only 15 minutes into the interview with Craig, Elges was even more suspicious of Craig. He answered every question with unnerving calm, like this was just a casual conversation, not an interview about a murder case. And so at some point, Elges just asked him point blank, did he kill Ben Oxley? Craig was quick to say no, and so Elges asked him if he would submit to a polygraph test. Craig said of course, whatever he could do to help. But he still looked weirdly calm. That is, until Elges stood up to go arrange for the lie detector test, at which point Craig's face suddenly crumpled and a loud sob escaped his mouth, and he burst into tears. The sudden flip of emotions really caught Elges off guard, and instinctively he walked over and offered Craig a tissue. Now, Elges was not about to dismiss Craig as a suspect just because now he seemed to be having a more natural reaction to the death of a family member, especially when you considered the fact that there were number 8 shells found in Craig's room, the same type that were used to kill Ben. But for some reason, Craig's outbreak of emotion here made Elges less convinced that this guy could be their killer. Elges told Craig to stay put for a while. He wanted he and his sister to just stay at the station for the time being. Soon, forensics would come back with the results of a gunshot residue test. They had conducted it on Craig and Melissa when they first arrived, and it would tell them whether or not either of them had fired a shotgun in the last 24 hours. While Elges waited for these results, he left the interview room to go grab a cup of coffee. He wanted to be on high alert when he met the next person he was bringing down to the station. Elges was just finishing his first cup of coffee and about to pour a second one when a uniformed officer ducked her head into the break room and told him that Dawn, Ben's ex-wife, had just shown up. The officer also told Elges that Dawn was aware that Ben was dead, and there was also one other thing that Elges should know. And that was that a year ago, after a judge had given Ben full custody of his and Dawn's daughter, that he and Dawn had gotten into a physical fight. The cops were called, and they wrote up the incident as mutual domestic battery. No charges were filed, but still, their divorce was clearly a very messy one. Elges nodded, left his coffee cup on the counter, and strode down the hallway toward interview room number 3. The second Elges stepped inside the room, he smelled alcohol. Dawn was bleary-eyed and her hair and clothes were disheveled. She looked up at him and made this joke that she felt like she was in a cop show on TV. Elges didn't react and just sat down across from her. But before he could ask her any questions, she just went off on Ben, saying what a bad guy he was and all these fights they had gotten into, and Elges began to think she must be drunk. It took him a few tries to get her quiet long enough to actually start their interview. However, once he got her to settle down, he was able to ask her what she'd been up to that night. Dawn began scratching her head and suddenly acting really cagey. She said that she was at home with her teenage kids, Devin and Brandy, and also their family friend, a 21-year-old named James Matleen. Dawn said she was good friends with James's mom, and James was almost like her surrogate kid. Dawn said they had all watched a couple of movies together before falling asleep around maybe 4 in the morning, and that none of them ever left the house. Elges smiled and told Dawn that was good. Everyone was accounted for. But Dawn didn't seem to be listening to him. She just started asking if Ben was really dead, over and over and over, until she got so worked up she started to cry. Finally, Elges just shut off the recorder and told Dawn she was free to go. She nodded and fumbled with her purse for a while and slowly made her way out of the room. Dawn seemed like a mess, like somebody who would not have been capable of sneaking into somebody's house and shooting them only a few hours earlier. Elges stepped out of the room, and a detective met him in the hallway to tell him that the gunshot residue test results on Craig and Melissa were back. Craig's hands were clean, meaning there was no way he could have fired a gun that night. But Melissa did have some residue on her. Now that could be because she was sleeping next to Ben when he was shot, but it could also be because she was the one who shot him. Elges thanked the detective, then just stood there thinking. The way Elges saw it, he had 2 compelling suspects. Melissa, who he just found out had gunshot residue on her, yet was strangely uninjured and didn't have blood spatter on her, and she was right next to Ben when he was killed. And Dawn, the ex-wife, who was this erratic, spiteful mess. He was fairly confident that Craig was not involved, and it was more likely that maybe Melissa stole his ammunition out of his room. But right now, Elges was exhausted. He had been up all night, and he knew he would be useless to this case if he didn't get some sleep. So he told the other investigators that he was going home for a nap. Then he would come back and look at the case with fresh eyes. The following day, on Friday, Elges was back at his desk at the sheriff's department, sorting through a pile of notes and reports on Ben's case. He still liked Melissa or Dawn for this murder, and he had been hoping that the forensics team might be able to provide more evidence that would help guide his investigation. But the preliminary medical examiner's report had come back, and it only confirmed what Elges already knew. Ben was killed with a shotgun at close range using a number 8 birdshot shell. Now, this was, of course, the same kind of ammo that was found in Craig's room, but the crime scene tech said that was not really actually incriminating. Number 8 birdshots were common ammunition for this part of Nevada, so it made sense that Craig might have a few rounds. Plus, neither of the shotguns that were found in Ben's garage had been fired recently, which meant that neither of them could be the murder weapon. And beyond that, there just hadn't been much evidence at all at the scene. Elges' team had canvassed Ben and Melissa's neighborhood, but none of the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Officers also interviewed dozens of friends and family members, hoping to drum up some leads, but one after another, the only things people had to say were about what a great guy Ben was. And it looked like Dawn's alibi was going to check out. Another detective had spoken to James Matleen, the family friend who was watching movies with Dawn and her teenage kids on the night Ben was killed, and he corroborated her story. Her kids did too. They had watched 2 action movies, then passed out sometime around 4 a.m. El just sighed, feeling stuck. He glanced over at his phone and saw he had a new voicemail. He put the phone to his ear. It was an insurance company, letting El just know that they had some information he might find interesting. Ben had a $400,000 life insurance policy, and Melissa was the sole beneficiary. Now, this life insurance policy was not very new, and Melissa had been the beneficiary since the two got married. So this was not enough to bring her back down to the station for more questions, but still, it was all Elgis really had, so he decided to keep a close eye on her. But over the next few days, Elgis and his team struggled to find any further evidence that incriminated Melissa or anybody else. And so to help the investigation along, the Douglas County Sheriff's Department set up a secret witness reward that guaranteed $12,500 to anyone who came forward with information that led to an arrest. But still, no solid leads came through. The following week, on March 7th, so 15 days after the murder, Melissa and the rest of her family held a memorial service for Ben, and more than 400 people came to pay their respects. And for Elgis, this confirmed what Ben's family had told him all along, that Ben truly was beloved. In the weeks that followed, that secret witness fund grew to over $22,000, and Ben's sister traveled all over Nevada hanging up posters to advertise the reward. But as weeks turned to months, the tip line stayed quiet and the case stalled out. Detective Elgis was out of leads and desperate. And then, one hot morning in June, he heard a rumor that piqued his interest. Ben had only been dead for 4 months, but Melissa had already begun dating again. In Elgis's opinion, this seemed pretty quick to move on, especially after your husband was murdered literally next to you in bed. Elgis thought of the $400,000 life insurance payout that Melissa now had coming, and suddenly he wondered if it might be time to bring her back down to the station after all. But a few days later, Elgis sat at his paper-strewn desk, staring down unhappily at the results from a polygraph test that he'd administered to Melissa. Now, polygraphs are not 100% reliable, so they're typically not admissible in court. But still, Elgis had sort of hoped that Melissa might fail her test when she was asked about Ben and the insurance money. But instead, Melissa had passed the test with flying colors. There was no deception detected. And so Elgis was beginning to fear that this case was going to go completely cold. But just then, Elgis's phone rang. It was another sergeant from his department, and he told Elgis they had been going back through some of the evidence in Ben's case with fresh eyes, specifically some security footage from businesses near Ben's home. And they had found something they missed the first time, and they had just emailed it to him. Elgis sat up in his chair, suddenly very alert. He thanked the sergeant and hung up, and then eagerly opened up his email. The footage he received was from a security camera in a 7-Eleven convenience store from around 1:30 in the morning on February 21st, so about 2 hours before Ben was murdered. In the footage, a person walked into the store with a baseball cap pulled down over their face, and they went up to the counter. And despite the hat on this person, Elgis realized he recognized the person he was looking at. And with this, after months of stall-out, he had a stunning new lead. He realized that all this time, someone he had spoken to during the investigation, that really he hadn't considered a suspect at all, had been lying to him. It would still take another full year and a risky plea deal to prove his theory, but finally, Sergeant Elgis knew what happened to Ben Oxley. Based on evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews collected over the course of 18 months, this is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Ben Oxley in the early hours of February 21st, 2008. It was just after 3 in the morning. The killers slowly made their way through the Oxley house, down the hallway, towards the primary bedroom and back. They made their way into the room, and they walked over to Ben's side of the bed. There they looked down, and they saw him fast asleep. They raised their shotgun. Their plan was to kill Ben and then flee. But as they stood there with their shotgun raised right at his face, ready to fire, their conscience stopped them. Suddenly they thought to themselves, what am I doing? The killer just stood there, frozen. And that's when they heard a creak coming from the hallway right behind them, right outside of the kids' bedrooms. And the sound actually spooked them so badly that they jumped, accidentally squeezing the trigger, killing Ben instantly. At this point, the killer panicked and ran out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and out the front door, leaving it wide open behind them. They jumped into their truck and they drove away. It would turn out the killer was someone the police had spoken to early in the investigation, but they did not initially see them as a suspect. That is, until they discovered that 7-Eleven video surveillance footage, which showed the young man who Ben's ex-wife, Dawn Oxley, had claimed was just her family friend, James Matleen. The police had not suspected James, because they didn't think he had any connection to Ben or a motive to kill him. What they didn't know was that he and Dawn were actually romantically involved. And because Dawn hated Ben so much, James decided he too hated Ben. But even knowing this, police couldn't prove that James killed Ben until November of 2009, because that was when Dawn got arrested for driving under the influence, and prosecutors offered her immunity on the drunk driving charge in exchange for her testimony about James, and she took it. She told them James was the killer. It was not until police arrested James that a much more full version of the story finally came out. James told police that it was true, he did kill Ben, but he also told them that he only did it because Dawn wanted him to. Apparently, she still blamed Ben for losing custody of her daughter, Alyssa. James told police that Dawn actually went into the house with him that night to show him where Ben slept. He said it was Dawn, not him, that Alyssa saw standing outside of her bedroom door right before the shotgun blast, the so-called shadow she told police about. However, by the time the police learned this version of events, it was too late to charge Dawn with any crimes at all. They had already given her immunity in exchange for her statement. On March 16, 2012, a little more than 4 years after the murder, James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Dawn, who may have been the mastermind of a crime that she never did time for, she died at the age of 50 in the year 2022. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories of journeys that seem to promise lots of adventure, but instead led somewhere far more sinister. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Headlights, and it's about a father and son who get lost in the woods during a hunting trip. The second story you'll hear is called Into Infinity, and it's about a mountaineering student in Alaska who walks where he shouldn't. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Signal, and it's about a man's trip into the Arctic wilderness that takes a turn for the worse. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button asks you to edit one of their YouTube videos, agree to do it, but then just permanently delete their channel. Okay, let's get into our first story called Headlights. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together, as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold, there might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful, and our stuff's getting wet, and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road, and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard, and it was starting to get dark outside, and so the pair decided, you know what, we got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark, and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before, and so it makes sense he might be tired. But, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on, they do have food, they do have water, And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together, like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon, that the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. Our next story is called Into Infinity. On July 11th, 1999, 17-year-old Thomas Nazaro was taking part in a month-long mountaineering course in Alaska. He, along with 10 other students and 3 instructors, had spent the past 26 days hiking up several peaks, and now they were taking a break at the base of this glacier. They were going to hike up the glacier, but before they did, it was customary to reward the students that had done the best job over the previous few weeks, taking on all the different mountaineering skills and survival skills, and allowing those students to hike on their own up this glacier for the last couple of days. And so the instructors hand chose a couple of students that fell into that category. Thomas was one of them, and told them after this break was over, they could head up and they would see them at the end of the trip. And so feeling very proud, Thomas and the other students who had been chosen stood up and began walking up this glacier. And after a couple of hours, they had made it about 3 miles up when they found this perfectly flat area that was perfect for camping out. And so they decided that that would be their campsite for the night. And so everybody started setting up their own tent and getting their sleeping bag laid out, and Thomas volunteered to go find some water. He had heard what sounded like a stream a little ways away from where their campsite was, and so Thomas grabbed his pot and he went around the corner out of sight. After a while, when all the other students had set up their campsites, they realized Thomas had not come back yet. And so they walked around this corner and they looked and they realized it was a dead end. About 100 feet in front of them is just a huge ice wall that goes up on all 3 sides, and there's nowhere else to go, but Thomas is not up there and he did not come back to the campsite. And so they're thinking, that's pretty weird. I mean, is he behind some ice crevasse that we can't see? And so as they're looking from a distance, they see that his water pot is sitting at the base of this ice cliff. And so they figure, okay, he's somewhere over there, obviously. And so they start walking up towards the base of the ice cliff, still yelling his name, and he's not yelling back. And they get about 3/4 of the way to this ice wall when one of the other students yells, "Stop!" And they all stop and look down where he's looking, and they all realize what's happened to Thomas. They turn around because it's extremely dangerous where they're walking, and they run back through their camp, down the trail, and they find their instructors and they tell them what they think happened to Thomas. Their instructors are horrified. They run up the trail. They make it just before the base of this ice wall to get as close as they can, knowing that it's very dangerous what they're trying to do, and they realize there's nothing they can do to help Thomas. And so before long, the police are called, and it's a full-scale rescue operation on top of this glacier. The theory of what happened to Thomas is he left his campsite with his pot of water, he went around the corner so he's out of sight, and he went to the stream, the glacier stream, and he started filling up his water, but it was taking a long time because the stream just was not very powerful. And from where he was, he would have heard the sound of rushing water coming from the ice wall, because there was water pouring down the ice wall. And so he would have walked over to the base of this ice cliff and put his jug out to get water, and as soon as he was right up against it, he would have slipped down into the ice. Because at the base of this ice wall was something called a moulin, which is a hole in the glacier caused by water runoff percolating down through a crack. And over the years, they can get pretty deep. And so when the police showed up, they went over to the hole and they're yelling down to Thomas, but they're not getting a response. So one of the skinnier officers put on a dry suit and then a harness, and then was lowered head first into this hole. And so the inside of a Mulan, it starts wide, but then it gets smaller and tighter all the way down until it comes to a point. But sometimes that point is very far down into the ice. And so this officer was hoping that at least, even if he couldn't get to Thomas, he could at least see Thomas. But after going 100 feet down, the hole got so narrow he couldn't go any farther, and even with his light, the hole just kept going. It was like into infinity all the way down into this glacier, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so after that officer was pulled out of the hole, the police went to a fiber optic cable that had a camera at the end of it, and they began lowering that down into this hole. And so down it went deeper and deeper. It passed the 100-foot mark and all the way down until they literally ran out of cable. And so from this camera's perspective, 250 feet down into this glacier, the hole just kept on going and going and going, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so they pulled the cable out and they realized there was nothing they could do for Thomas. Since he was below 250 feet, that means he fell at least 250 feet, and so it's unlikely he survived the fall to wherever it eventually stopped. And if he did somehow survive the fall, which is a horrifying thought in some ways, he would have been wedged somewhere deep down inside of this glacier, and the water runoff coming off of the ice wall would have eventually filled up all around him and gone over his head, and he would have drowned. And so shortly after the search was started, they called it off. There really was nothing they could do. And unfortunately, his body was never recovered. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Signal. On the morning of August 7th, 1981, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer named Carl McCunn stood on the edge of a lake in the Alaskan wilderness and chucked a box of ammunition into the water. The splash it made was surprisingly loud in the total silence that surrounded him. Carl was on the last day of a 5-month-long solo camping trip in a very remote area of northern Alaska that was actually inside the Arctic Circle. A plane had dropped him off here in early spring, and he had set up his tent by this lake, which was surrounded on all sides by forest and huge snowy mountains. And during this 5-month trip, Carl had not seen or spoken to another person the entire time. There were no phones, no roads, no rangers, no people around for at least 100 miles. I mean, this is true isolation. Carl looked up into the sky and listened carefully for the low roar of the plane that was supposed to pick him up today. But as he listened, he couldn't hear anything. But this didn't worry Carl, because he actually had only arranged for his pickup date, not the pickup time. So it was just at some point on this day he was going to get picked up. He didn't know exactly when. And so as he anxiously waited, he just kind of puttered around his campsite and continued to pack up his things. And as Carl did this, he remembered that the type of plane that was going to be picking him up today, it was his buddy Rory's plane, it was really small. And there was a chance that he couldn't actually fit all of his belongings on the plane. And so in anticipation of this, he had identified that he didn't need all of his ammo. And so that's why he was chucking his ammo into the lake, basically in preparation for pickup. Just then, a breeze kicked up, and so Carl zipped his parka up to his chin. This was actually the so-called warm season in the Arctic Circle, but warm in the Arctic Circle meant still near freezing temperatures at night. And as much as Carl loved being out in the wilderness, doing these solo camping trips out in the middle of nowhere, he really was excited to get back to his home in Anchorage, Alaska, and see his friends and call his dad and, be in a nice warm house for once. Carl was about to chuck his 6th and final box of ammunition into the lake when he heard the loud sound of a wolf howling on the other side of the lake, and it made him stop for a second, and he decided that, maybe until the plane gets here, I'll hold on to at least 1 box of ammunition. So he stuck this final box into his bag, he picked it up, and then he walked along the shoreline up to where he had rigged a net to catch some fish. And when he got to the net, he saw he had caught 2 trout. And so he scooped the fish out, he went back to his campsite, he made a fire, cooked the fish, and as he sat down to eat them, he just kept looking up to the sky and listening, hoping for this plane to arrive soon. When he was done eating, Carl made a quick entry into his diary, kind of detailing the last day at camp, and then he finished packing up all his stuff, and he brought it all down to the waterline, ready to be picked up, and then he sat on his trunk, again, just kind of waiting for his friend to show up. and by this time it was about mid-afternoon, and still no sign of the plane. But nonetheless, Carl sat there kind of taking in the scene, this beautiful lake and nature. I mean, this is the last time he's going to be here, and so he's trying to appreciate it. After all, this had been a really successful photography trip. He had shot 500 rolls of film that he knew he could sell, and that would make enough money that he'd be able to do this again the following year. And so as Carl sat there taking in the scene and daydreaming about next year's trip, he noticed the sun was beginning to set. And when he noticed this was kind of like the first time that Carl actually became worried. This far north, the sun stayed out for nearly 20 hours a day in the summer. And so if the sun was setting right now, that meant it had to be near midnight. And so his friend Rory, who was supposed to pick him up today at some point today, well, now that we've hit midnight, Carl knew his friend had officially missed the date. And Carl had no way of contacting him to see what had happened or when he would be here. And so as dusk fell, and still there was no sign of Rory, Carl continued to get more and more anxious. And finally, he had to reset up his tent, and he crawled inside, got in a sleeping bag, and went to sleep praying that his friend would be there the next day. The next day, Carl got up early and packed up his stuff and waited by the shoreline for his friend, but all day he waited, and the plane still never came. Carl tried to convince himself that, maybe his friend got mixed up on the dates, or, maybe something came up that's delayed him a couple of days, but he'll be here. But then another day came and went, and then another, and still no plane. And it was around this time that Carl remembered something that made him feel sick to his stomach. On the night 6 months earlier, when he and Rory had discussed pickup plans, Carl remembered that night had been filled with drinking. I mean, these guys were just laughing and having a good time. And at some point, as the beers were flowing, Carl had asked Rory, "Hey, can you pick me up on August 7th at the end of my trip?" And Rory had said, "Yeah, I can probably do that." But Rory had also said that he would have to check his schedule first before he could 100% commit to this. And Carl, in his excitement about going on this trip and getting ready for it and all that, had just forgotten to follow up with Rory and make absolutely sure he could pick him up. And so now Carl was realizing that Rory wasn't delayed or mixed up about the dates. Rory wasn't coming. And Carl knew there was zero chance of another plane just happening to fly over the area and that plane picking him up. I mean, for the entire summer Carl had been out here, he had literally not seen any planes. His best hope was that his dad or maybe one of his friends would report him missing. But he knew that was unlikely, and it actually was his own doing. Carl traveled constantly and almost never told people where he was going or when he'd be back. And on one trip recently, Carl had gone out and missed his return date, and his dad had been concerned about him and so called the police. And when Carl had come back and realized what his dad did, he told his dad to never do that again. "Never contact authorities if I'm late. I'm fine." And all of this meant now Carl was going to face a brutal Alaskan winter all by himself with limited supplies and only a single box of ammunition. A few weeks later, at the end of August, Carl was still stuck out in the Alaskan wilderness. By now, Carl had fully accepted that Rory was not going to come pick him up, and Carl was doing his best not to fixate on his stupid mistake. He figured he had two choices. The first one was that he could just stay put and hope to be rescued. This was the conservative option. He knew how to get food and also firewood near his campsite, so he wouldn't starve to death and he wouldn't freeze. But this would only keep him alive. This would not actually get him rescued. The other choice was that Carl could pack up his campsite and attempt to basically hike out of here 75 miles to the nearest city, called Fort Yukon. Now, this could get him home, but with it came a much higher chance of death. If Carl did the hike, well, those 75 miles would be over extremely rough terrain with absolutely zero human-made trails. And so one little slip up and he could fall and get hurt or get lost. And also finding food was sort of a toss-up, and the weather at best would be brutal and at worst would be fatal. Plus, the entire region those 75 miles were in was absolutely teeming with wolves. Carl knew both of these choices were bad. but he was running out of time to make a decision. The brutal Arctic winter was fast approaching, and if Carl was going to attempt this horrible hike, he would really have to do it soon. And so as Carl thought about what he was going to do, he trudged his way over to one of his rabbit snares, and he was so happy to see he had caught a rabbit. And so he took the rabbit back to his camp and he cooked it over the fire, and as he's eating it, he's thinking, you know what, this isn't so bad. I caught food for now. I mean, this will keep me alive at least for a couple of days. Maybe I should just stay here. But deep down, he knew the staying put option was not a real option. I mean, even though, yes, by staying here, he could keep himself from starving, he knew how to get food and all that, well, he'd still be a sitting duck for all the predators in the area, and there were many, and remember, he only has one box of ammunition. But just then, Carl heard the most glorious sound, the distant whine of a small plane engine. At first, he thought he must be hearing things. Remember, he has not seen a plane at all since he got here. But sure enough, he looked up into the sky, and a second later, he saw a plane flying directly towards his camp, low and slow. Carl ran in his tent and grabbed the most brightly colored thing he could find, his sleeping bag, which was bright orange. He ran outside of his tent and began waving it back and forth to get the pilot's attention. Carl saw the plane belonged to the Alaska State Troopers, and so he figured his friends must have reported him missing, and now the police were out to rescue him. A moment later, the plane passed directly over Carl's camp so low to the ground that Carl could actually see the pilot looking back at him. Carl looked right at the pilot's eyes, and when Carl was nearly certain he had just made eye contact with the pilot, he threw his fist up in the air in excitement and jumped up and down. He couldn't believe it. He was saved. The pilot was going to land and take him home. With a big grin on his face, Carl watched as this plane, sure enough, made a big U-turn, and then Carl watched the plane make another pass over the camp, low and slow, which Carl figured meant, the pilot was looking for a place to land. And so as the pilot was doing that, Carl rushed to his campsite and began packing everything up, and as he did, he's kind of keeping an eye out, watching the plane, looking for it to land, but it didn't. The plane just kept on flying straight away from Carl's campsite until it disappeared over the horizon. For the rest of the day, Carl just stared off into the distance, hoping for this plane to come back, but it didn't. Lying inside his tent that night, Carl couldn't sleep. He was so shaken up by what had happened that day. He didn't understand, he saw the pilot. The pilot seemed like they were looking back at him. Why didn't they land? Why didn't they stop? Carl told himself that, maybe the terrain was too rough and there was no way for the pilot to land. That was possible. And so perhaps this pilot was flying back and getting another plane, maybe a float plane to land on the water. Carl didn't know, but he felt like that could be a possibility, and it sort of made him feel a little bit better. But he still couldn't relax enough to sleep. And so, knowing he was just going to lay there all night, he sat up, turned on his flashlight, and began looking for something to read, just to occupy his mind. Now, at this point, Carl has been out in the wilderness all alone for months and months, and he's been stranded for weeks. He has read all of his books and all of his magazines like 1,000,000 times. He's even read his diary a dozen times. I mean, he's read everything. And so as he was looking around his tent, he was looking for literally anything else to read. And suddenly, he found something. His hunting license. It was like the one thing he had not closely read. Not an exciting thing to read, but new. It was just a little paper certificate with some rules and regulations and safety tips about hunting. And so Carl just began reading the front, and he read it all the way down. And then he flipped it over and he continued reading. But then he saw something that made his heart practically stop. At first he thought maybe he misunderstood. But no, he read it over and over again, and it was very clear. And so Carl looked up in shock. He suddenly understood why that pilot had left him. For weeks, Carl stayed close to his camp, just hoping and praying that somehow, some way, that plane would still come back. But it never did. And by the time Carl had actually accepted this fact that really the plane's not coming back, well, by that point, it was too late to try to hike out. So all he could do was stay put. However, the lake had frozen over, so he couldn't fish. His snares all sat empty because all the wolves and foxes got to his catches before he could. By October, Carl was getting really skinny. By November, Carl was genuinely starving. On November 26th, Thanksgiving Day, Carl laid inside of his tent and made a diary entry. There would be no Thanksgiving feast for him today. His food stores were totally gone, and the Arctic winter was getting so bad. In fact, his fingers and toes were turning black from frostbite, and he was sick all the time and constantly had chills. And as Carl wrote in his diary, he looked out the tent flap at his dying fire, knowing he had no more firewood. He knew he only had one choice left to make. He scratched a final sentence into his diary. He wrote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Then he set his diary on the floor of the tent near his rolls of film. Then he reached for his rifle and his last box of ammo. A little while later, a single shot rang out across the lake. A couple months later, in early February of 1982, Alaska State Troopers would find Carl. Carl was deceased. He had taken his own life. What Carl had only realized later was that when he made that fist pump when he was so excited when that pilot had flown overhead and he thought he was going to get rescued, well, that fist pump had sealed his fate. Because, like it said on Carl's hunting license, a single arm raised in the air is the universally recognized body sign for all okay, do not wait. And so when that Alaska State Trooper pilot flew over Carl's camp, he did make eye contact with Carl. He saw him. But he also saw Carl raising his fist in the air and thought he was okay, and so he turned around and he left. If Carl had only read that hunting license a little bit sooner, he would have known to have raised 2 hands in the air as the pilot flew over for the universal sign that means, pick me up. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.